Hi everyone, and welcome to Deep Geek Live. I have got a very special guest today. You may not have seen her on this channel yet, but she has been in the chat before. She's been on LML's channel a few times, and I think you are in for a treat. Gretchen, do you want to say hi?
Hello, everyone. Many of you I know from chat, whether on, as Robert said, whether on this chat or in other chats. So hi, I'm Gretchen. I also go by Baal the Bard because my background is in Hebrew and I'm a big giant nerd. So I tried to play on that with Baal in the story and just chose Baal. Just to make things complicated, got to throw in that extra apostrophe in there. So, yep. Hi, everybody.
Excellent. Well, welcome. I'm very excited. Do you want to just very quickly tell people where they might be able to find you on the internet?
Yes, so I do have a YouTube channel, which is Baal the Bard, and you can find me there. You can also find me on Twitter. My handle on Twitter is at @GNEllisWriter, and I have a website, gnellis.com, and all of my video essays on YouTube, I have the written form on my website, as well as some other stuff that I've written in the past. I'm also the managing editor of a fandom analysis website. So I cover all sorts of books and television. I mostly do analysis and some reviews. So you can find me there, and that is thefandamentals.com. And those are the big ones. And I'm very excited to be here. I've been following Robert for a while, and this is going to be fun. I'm really excited to talk about House Targaryen.
Yes, and House Targaryen is what we are all about today. So, guys, we've done a few different houses over the last few weeks. We looked at House Stark last week, and today we're going to be looking at House Targaryen. As usual, what we're going to do is I'm going to frame this around the questions I've got from my patrons, but obviously if there's anything coming up on the super chat, or we'll pick out things from the chat as we go through, then we'll come to them straight away. I have a couple of things that I want to pick up from last time. I did a random live stream, I think last weekend at Europe Friendly Time, and there were a couple of things there that I missed because I forgot to tell the mods I was doing it, so I didn't have any support. So there are a couple of questions that I didn't pick up, and I promised to pick up today. Lucky asked about my thoughts about Jon and Mira being twins. My instinct on this, you'll see I've started doing, finally I've got to my Tower of Joy videos, and my take is that no, they are not twins. I personally believe that Jon is the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, and that Mira is the daughter of Ashara and Howland. So that's where I think that all fits in. Yes, they were born around the same sort of time. Yes, on the show, they've both got very luscious, curly, dark locks that look very similar, but I do not think that they are twins. They just happen to have been born around the same time. Stephen Stark just spotted. Thank you so much for that super chat, saying managed to make it live this week. Gretchen rocks. I agree. That's why I got Gretchen on here. So we will get the benefit of her wisdom in just a moment. But why don't we start? Actually, I'll throw a question at you already. I'll come back to this, to the previous questions in a second. But Gretchen, why don't I throw to you Jack Hurst, who did a super chat before we went live, who said, Grey Area made a video earlier comparing Cersei's life fighting against prophecy to Rhaegar's fighting to fulfill it. Would they have made a good match? What do you think?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think personality-wise, Rhaegar probably would have been less, made Cersei's life a bit less complicated than, to put it mildly, than Robert did. That really is fascinating, because I think that, her interacting with him about fulfilling prophecy, it probably would have raised her own questions about her view of prophecy probably much sooner in her life than it did, because by the time he met Cersei, it feels like some things have been simmering for a while, but that the real reason she's starting to get so paranoid about prophecy is because of the situation with Marjorie. And I mean, I think Sansa kind of kicks it out, the younger, more beautiful queen, but Sansa and then Marjorie and then everything that happened with Tyrion is what really started to kind of have Cersei start to really go downhill and kind of fall into the paranoia that we see her in her obsession with avoiding prophecy. I think that if she had married Rhaegar, his obsession with fulfilling prophecy might have exacerbated that earlier in her life. She probably would have had to face what prophecy means a little bit sooner than she did, which would have been interesting for her. So maybe in the beginning, maybe in the beginning they would have made a better match because Rhaegar probably would have been more faithful to her than Robert was. She might have felt a bit less unwanted with Rhaegar than she clearly did with Robert. I don't think Rhaegar would have said a lover's name in bed the way Robert did on their wedding night, which I think kind of shaped Cersei's perspective on their marriage. But I think she might have gone downhill sooner, and she might have like fallen into her kind of paranoia and obsession with prophecy maybe sooner in her life than Rhaegar. And if Rhaegar thought that he needed to have a second wife, even after his relationship with Cersei, like if that wouldn't change his opinion of Lyanna and feeling like he needed to have Lyanna to have a very special baby, then maybe he wouldn't have died of the trident. Maybe Cersei would have found a way to poison his wine or poison his harp strings or something. And so yeah, I guess my final answer is it might have initially been better, but a better relationship. But I think maybe it would have gone downhill sooner than things did with Robert. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think that clearly later on in life, Cersei very strongly starts to believe in prophecy. Rhaegar, from quite early on in his life, very strongly agrees with prophecy and believes in it. I don't think myself, in terms of a match, that a belief in prophecy necessarily is a good match. I don't think that's the basis for a strong relationship. I think that they're actually fundamentally slightly different people.
Right.
And so for me, I would say Cersei, the reason why she is pushing against prophecy is because she sees it as a threat to herself. And so it's actually about her. Rhaegar seems to be wanting to fulfill prophecy because he thinks that he has some kind of duty or role to perform in order to save humanity in some way. So I think at this kind of fundamental level, they are quite different. I think it's a fascinating question because there was this possibility of the match between the two of them, but I don't think it would have worked out very well. Florian, thank you so much. 20CHF. I'm going to have to play the guessing game on currencies again there. Not entirely sure what that is, but thank you so much for the super chat. First time I get to catch you live. Thanks for all your incredible content. Thank you. I really do appreciate that. And I think I saw Dark Mother as well, $6.66 with a myth head takeover. There we go. So the myth heads are here in force. I see LML himself is here in the chat. Hi, good to see you, LML. Quickly dipping back before we get fully into the Targaryen world, Consis, this is again from last time, saying, is there any way you could ever see Arya become the queen in the north? If so, how? Personally, I don't think so. I don't think Arya, either in the books or on the show, I don't think that's what she wants. She's not about the personal power. I did a video on Arya a few days ago. The two big themes running through her story are her personal identity and death. And I think those are the things which are going to be what drives her story forward. And I don't think being a lady or being a ruler of some kind is where she's about. And the last question I've got that I didn't pick up on from last time, Shadow Fox asked, which was a great question, saying, Robb, Jon, Bran, and Rickon are all named for important men in Ned's life, which is an incredibly good observation. Who do you think Sansa and Arya are named after? What I did was I said I was going to throw that to my favorite Game of Thrones family tree geek, who is Secrets of the Citadel. I have done that. I did see her in the chat a little bit earlier, and I'm hoping that she might be able to come up with a few ideas about who that might be. Let's go back to a couple of questions about the Targaryens. So Bonds asks, is it possible that Aegon, the son of Rhaegar and Elia, was swapped and survived the sack of King's Landing? If so, is there another Targaryen out there? And would this Targaryen be higher or greater in precedence than Jon or Dany? Could this Targaryen appear at the last minute to take the Iron Throne? Bonds, I know this is related to your theory that you sent me a while ago. I've had a flick through it. It's quite long. I don't know if I'm going to get a chance to read every word of it. I think I would agree with certainly the first half of what you're saying about who a young Griff probably is, though I'm not sure I'd necessarily agree with the second half of what you're saying. But I'm going to throw this one over to Gretchen, who I'm sure has thought about this before. So Aegon, the son who Rhaegar and Elia had, do you think he survived? There are hints of it in the novels. Do you think that that's possible?
I think it is possible. I don't think it's plausible. I think that the amount of advanced planning that would be required to spirit away a baby, I think that they would have had to know. I think it would have been difficult to enact that kind of plan without forewarning, without knowing that was happening. I think that so I do understand why people believe that. I think it is a plausible theory, or I think it's possible. I don't think it's plausible based on what we have in the story. But if George were to reveal that as what happened, I could see it making sense, is what I'll say. I don't think it would come entirely out of the blue if that's what he did. But I don't think that is what's going on with this story. I think it is far more possible or plausible that the Aegon that we know is a pretender of some kind. Whether he is a Blackfyre, whether he is a Blackfyre and a Brightflame, or a Brightfyre, or some combination thereof, or someone totally unrelated that they're trying to pass off as a Targaryen, I find that far more likely than that Aegon is actually Aegon, the child of Rhaegar and Elia.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think that it would require a certain degree of forethought that we're saying that Varys got a child in, swapped the child over, knowing that baby would be killed and face destroyed beyond recognition in order to therefore get away with this baby swap. So I think that requires a degree of foresight that Varys probably doesn't have. All the hints that we seem to be getting from this massive, in the books, obviously it's not on the show, but this massive plot that's going on with young Griff and old Griff and Illyrio and Varys and the Martells and all the rest of it, all the interlinked parts here, all seem to be hinting that he is a Blackfyre. There's a possibility. I think I would agree with you that there's a possibility that it is actually that he is actually who he says he is, who people say he is. But it seems likely to me that he is actually a Blackfyre, a descendant through the female line of Blackfyre. So that's what I think is likely. Quick shout out to Medieval X Demon Pattern. Thank you so much.
What a great name.
It is a great name. I had to concentrate on that one. Shout out from Arizona. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We'll stick with the subject, in fact, of Aegon. Actually, I do want to, before I forget, Maura Lee did some very generous super chats before we went live. Thank you so much, Maura. You know how much I appreciate your support. Saying, thoroughly enjoying all the stories on the well-told tale and can't wait for part 2 of The Machine Stops. I will talk about that a little bit later because this is a story that I'm loving telling on the well-told tale. And also saying, fire and blood. This is in honor of all the strong women leaders rulers of House Targaryen mentioned in both Fire and Blood Part 1 and The Song of Ice and Fire. Absolutely, this was, for me, it was one of the big emphases of Fire and Blood, was the amount of female Targaryens that came to the fore, when previously we just thought of this as being a long line of male rulers. It turns out actually that was an oversimplification, as it is obviously in our history as well, but it was certainly an oversimplification in Targaryen history. And also for the mods, and thank you, moderators. I see Christopher Oldstones is definitely in the chat. Lovely to see you there, Chrissy. Thank you so much. Did you want to pick up on any of that, actually? Well, we're just sort of here about the sort of the emphases in Fire and Blood in the House Targaryen, and particularly the female characters.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is that Fire and Blood, for a story that is purportedly about House Targaryen, and so far as we knew before Fire and Blood, we had predominantly stories about male characters. The only ones I think that really stood out prior to Fire and Blood was we knew about Rhaenyra and the dance, and a couple of other female characters. What intrigued me was that, given what we knew of the House Targaryen, and even given the expressed in-universe point of view bias of the narrator in the story, I read Fire and Blood and finished it and thought, wow, what a book about women. Like, that those are the real standout characters, at least to me, that I felt like I walked away thinking about all of the really interesting and complicated female characters. And especially for a book that with a maester as an author who tends to be fairly dismissive towards the contributions of women in politics, that I walked away feeling like this was a book primarily about Targaryen women. That even though there are some, interesting and strong male characters, but even Jaehaerys, the story of Jaehaerys, I felt like was more about Alysanne than it was about Jaehaerys. And so many of the other stories were like that. And I really appreciated that, because much like our own history, the contribution of women, especially in the political sphere, has tended to be overlooked, and they tend to be fairly invisible. And I mean, I have very strong opinions about what I think Martin is doing with that and why, but I did feel like he was trying to get us to look at our own history and realize that our history is much like Fire and Blood, where the figureheads, the people that are paid attention to, are, the male claimants, the ones who sit on the throne, the people who supposedly hold all the power. But really, there are so many women whom affect history, and their stories may not be told, and we don't recognize them. Like, I want to know about all the women who helped in the dance. He talked about the time of the wolves and all of these women who were the ones who were making sure that peace, they were the negotiators. They were the ones who were, forging peace talks between all of the families after kind of the fallout of the Dance of Dragons. And even just throwing that out there, that peace wouldn't have been possible if, these 4 or 5 women hadn't spearheaded reasonable, sensible negotiation and peace talks and communication. Things like Alysanne being able to win over Alaric Stark, or Black Aly Blackwood and Cregan Stark, her being able to kind of soften his intensity. And I think that is something that has tended to get overlooked in our own history. So I appreciate the way that Martin presented these stories as a mirror of our own history in a way that I think is trying to get us to look more closely, to read between the lines and think about our own history and say, I wonder how much this has been true that we haven't been able to acknowledge. How many of these women have existed in our own history that have done all of these things that we just don't talk about because we're so focused on, the person who is sitting on the throne and wearing the crown. But that doesn't mean that they're the only one who's important to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think I can really add to that. I thought that was really interesting, valuable. One thing that I found myself doing when I was first reading through Fire and Blood was I was just sort of making a few notes as I went through, and I started noting down all the times when Targaryen women had actually really been ruling the continent. And I started out, and it suddenly became clear, Aegon the Conqueror actually he wasn't really ruling most of the time. He was off around and about on his travels and all the rest of it. And the rest of the time, his two sisters were sitting on the Iron Throne and their word was law. So actually they were really ruling alongside him, but they're never mentioned as like on the same level as being a monarch. Then we get this whole series of women who were the heir to the throne and didn't inherit for whatever reason because somebody took it away from them. Then we get Alysanne, we've already talked about. We get a woman who actually sat on the throne and was queen in King's Landing for half a year. Gets wiped out by the history books. We get Queen's Regent. There, I actually had to give up on trying to note down all of these because it just became so obvious that the female characters had been completely written out of the earlier history that we got. And here, even though it was still slightly in-universe grudging, it was very apparent that was there, that the Targaryen women had been ruling the nation. And what that left me with the question was that, is this George R. R. Martin trying to give us some hint about what Dany's fate might be? Is this that she might rule it but never get credited for it? Is it that actually finally we will get a Targaryen queen ruling? It wasn't quite clear, but it was very clear that actually we shouldn't see Dany and this kind of succession crisis that is looming for the Targaryens, certainly in the books. We shouldn't see that as something new or strange. This has always been the way. Targaryens.
Right. And even throughout Westeros, I mean, that's one of the big things that I talk about on my channel, my first video that I have on my channel. And one of the things, I have a big long series of essay talking about disinherited and disempowered women. And we have so many stories, not just of Targaryens, but also throughout Westeros and even a little bit in Essos, though I think that George has more stories in Essos of having sort of equality. We know that Dorne practices absolute primogeniture rather than male preference primogeniture, which just means that in Dorne, the oldest child inherits regardless of gender, versus the west of Westeros, which is oldest son inherits. And if there is no oldest son, then either an uncle or the husband of the oldest daughter will inherit rather than the woman. And so I had come into Fire and Blood with my own thesis about what Martin was doing with disempowered women. And then I read Fire and Blood and it was just like, oh, yes, absolutely. He's trying to draw attention, I think, to the ways in which women have been disempowered and the ways that their stories are written out, because I think that he clearly finds that to be a problem. In my opinion, I know there are people who disagree, but in my opinion, the way that Martin, especially the way he kind of throws shade at his own narrator sometimes, where he seems to be getting us to be like, you don't take this guy so seriously. Like, his is not the perspective that you're supposed to question that perspective, question even the narrative voice, and to walk away feeling like, oh, hey, yeah, these women ought to have been inherited. There's so many Targaryen women who were passed over for the throne. Someone in chat pointed out that Queen Alysanne wanted Daenerys, her daughter Daenerys, to inherit, which is interesting because in the world of Ice and Fire, Daenerys doesn't exist. They have a different child. There's a different birth order in the world of Ice and Fire, and Dany isn't in the world of Ice and Fire, but she's in Fire and Blood. So it's almost like Martin made a correction and then added in this story of like, oh, right, Queen Alysanne also had a daughter that she wanted to inherit. It happens with Rhaena, one of Maegor's brides. She's the oldest child and she's passed over in favor of Jaehaerys. I mean, yeah, I could list off. There's so many Targaryen oldest daughters. Even Visenya. Visenya is the oldest child. Aegon is not the oldest. So even the fact that that Aegon was crowned king of Westeros says something that was probably practiced in Valyria as well, because Visenya is the oldest child of the three. So technically, if they had practiced oldest child inherits, Visenya would have been queen rather than Aegon being king.
Yes, exactly. And the one other place that has this kind of equal
Inheritance, yeah.
Inheritance was is Greywater Watch. It would appear intriguingly.
Yeah.
But I have my theories on that. That if you've watched my Howland and Ashara video, you'll know why. Just going quickly to Kyle Lachico. Thank you so much for the super chat. Can the Maesters be to blame for the death of the Targ dynasty and or the death of all the dragons? Well, I'll have a quick pitch at this one first before passing it over to Gretchen. So I don't think we can blame them completely for the death of the Targ dynasty or the death of the dragons. The Targaryens did a fantastic job of killing themselves and their dragons in the Dance of the Dragons. That was down to them. The Maesters may well indeed have been encouraging that. That's a little bit tinfoily, but this was the Targaryens killing themselves effectively. In terms of the end of it, if we don't count Dany and Aegon and Jon and all the rest of it, then the sort of the fall of the dynasty, the fall of King Aerys, is that to do with the Maesters? Well, perhaps they had a hand in it, but again, if Aerys had been an able and strong ruler, there's every chance that he would have survived by not killing off lots of people like Brandon Stark and Rickard Stark, just for starters, for example. But in terms of the dragons, after the Dance of the Dragons, yes, I do personally believe that was the Maesters poisoning them. But what do you think, Gretchen? How much can we blame the Maesters for all this?
I think I would come down very similarly to you. I don't think that we can blame the Maesters for the dance because they really were. The Targs seem to have done a pretty good job killing themselves off and didn't really seem to need a lot of help for that. The succession crisis, I think, was enough. What it potentially feels like is after the dance, given how decimated the family tree was after the Dance of Dragons, that perhaps the Maesters saw an opportunity to kind of finish things off and prevent the birth of more dragons, because they had dragons that caused so much destruction, not just in the dance, but throughout the history of Westeros, even the initial conquest. And then, oh gosh, I'm so terrible with names, but the little girl in Dorne who says everywhere the dragons danced, the people died, is that has been true throughout Targaryen history. Whenever dragons fight dragons, people are going to die. And so when you have this kind of decimated family line and you really only have one or two dragons left, I mean, why not step in? If you're the Maesters, why not step in and prevent the birth of any more dragons, and in some sense prevent more destruction from potentially happening in the future? Because Targaryens without their dragons are the equivalent of any other house in Westeros in terms of military power. They have that was their real true advantage, was the ability to have these basically weapons of mass destruction that they could wipe out whole armies. And without their dragons, they don't really have the same power that they used to. So I could definitely see them stepping in that point and saying, is there a way that we can finish off the dragons that are still alive and prevent the birth of more dragons? So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And the Targaryens actually, if anything, have got less strong armies, certainly smaller armies than most of the other regions of Westeros. When they invaded with very, very few people. It wasn't a massive army. It was the dragons that won it for them. You look across to the Reach or up to the north, these are big armies going on, much, much bigger than anything that House Targaryen or the Crownlands could put together.
Right. I was just going to add, the Targaryens have never needed to kind of build up a military presence the way that any of the other houses in Westeros did, because they had their dragons. So without their dragons, they had, in a sense, nothing really left to fall back on. And because they're foreign, they're not native to Westeros, they also don't really have the house ties that other people have. They don't kind of have the levies that other main houses can draw on their bannermen and their levies. Yeah. But the Targaryens never needed to have that, make those connections. So without their dragons, you're right, they're at a significant disadvantage.
Yes, agreed.
Militarily.
And I think it was Pablo in the chat was saying about when I was saying Greywater Watch is the other place that has equal inheritance, and he was saying Bear Island as well. I think we don't have the full information on exactly how the inheritance works there, and yes, certainly the women, certainly the after Jorah left, then it reverted back up to Major Mormont to be ruling. That does not necessarily mean that they have some kind of equal inheritance. That might just simply be that House Mormont was just dying out and she was the only person left. They've got a very distinct culture going on there on Bear Island, where the men would be doing fishing and going out and things like that, and the women would be staying not just at home, but they would be defending the home. So that's why we get this very strong independent female culture which grew up in Bear Island, but we don't know huge amounts about their inheritance laws.
Right.
Johan Eriksson, thank you so much for the super chat, saying the second Blackfyre rebellion was stopped mostly by Sir Maynard Plum. Do you think he was a spy for Bloodraven, or could he be Bloodraven in disguise? So this is something that we read about in the third of the Dunk and Egg stories, the Mystery Knight, when Dunk stumbles, as is his way, into this massive plot to have a Blackfyre rebellion, and he bumps into this chap called Maynard Plum, who disappears, and then a moment or two later, Bloodraven appears, and the plot is disrupted, and the second Blackfyre rebellion is effectively stopped before it even really starts. My take is that the hints in the story are that yes, Maynard Plum was Bloodraven. Bloodraven seemed to know a huge amount about what Duncan had been up to and all the rest of it, and that seems to only be likely if it came from Maynard Plum himself. But did you have a thought on that one? Do you think it's him?
Yeah. Because isn't there that moment where Dunk approaches him and he feels like for a second that it looks like there's a glamour going on?
Yeah.
So to my mind, that was fairly definitive that it's Bloodraven. I don't know what happened to the real, I guess, Maynard Plum at that point, or whether or not there's at some point he'd switched places with him, or if it was always Bloodraven. But I feel like at least at that moment, those interactions, it was Bloodraven.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, my take, I'd have to read it through again. My take was that it was probably Bloodraven all the way through. This being Dunk, he didn't think, oh, that's a glamour going on. He just thought, oh, this is it's almost as if I can't quite make out his features kind of thing. So it's clearly there was something strange going on there. And the most, or the simplest solution is that it was actually Bloodraven himself who was a magic user.
Yep.
I think we had, so Frown Pouch, $10. Thank you so much. That's very kind, saying no question, just thank you and have great days. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Let's get back to the questions from Patreon. We were talking about Fagon, this character in the books who claims to be Aegon Targaryen, the son of Rhaegar and Elia. Torsten D asks, or says, I think in a recent live stream or video, you mentioned that you think Daenerys will kill Fagon. Wouldn't it be more fitting for the three heads, that three dragons, one of them might be a mother's dragon, but still fight the, fight the others? So that certainly sounds like the kind of thing that I may well have said, that Daenerys will kill Fagon. I think it's entirely likely. And I base a lot of this from the House of the Undying, when she is called the Slayer of Lies. And I think that clearly one of these lies, for me, is that this is actually Aegon Targaryen. I think he's not Aegon Targaryen, and I think that she will reveal that some way, and I think that that will lead to his death. So whether she personally does it, whether it's through Dragonfire, I do not know, but that seems likely to me. I don't have any definitive evidence, but it seems quite likely to me. The other thing, just in terms of the three heads, that I would just sort of throw in there is that George R. R. Martin rather cryptically has said that we shouldn't necessarily think, he says, yes, three heads of the dragon, yes, but we shouldn't necessarily assume that they're all Targaryens. So I'll just throw that one out there and then sort of put it over to Gretchen. Have you got any take on how he might die, or the three heads of the dragon, whether he might be part of that?
You put it very well. What I think that Dany, she may or may not be the hand. She may not be the hand that wields the sword that leads to Aegon's death, or even the rider of the dragon, if, you know, maybe he's eaten or burned by a dragon. But I do think that that is one of the lies that she has to expose, and that exposing that will eventually lead to his death. Like, I don't see Aegon surviving this story. I don't think that that is what he's set up for in any way. I can't imagine him surviving. And I think that Dany's role will be to precipitate that in some way. In some way, she's going to be involved, whether or not she kills him or not. Maybe not. Maybe she doesn't wield the killing blow, but whether her exposing him for being a pretender might eventually lead to his death. Absolutely. I could very much see that taking place. And as far as the three heads, I think it is interesting that Martin threw that out there, because I think it generates questions, because now if we see someone riding a dragon that, say, we may not expect, then we might be able to ask questions about their parentage, but not necessarily. For example, Tyrion Lannister, who many people have proposed will be one of the heads of the dragon. That seems well enough foreshadowed, especially with the Savas game and the white dragon kind of ending up at his feet. Feels like Tyrion will be involved some way with the dragon. But does that mean Tyrion is a secret Targaryen? According to George, not necessarily. He could still be a secret Targaryen, but I think it leaves open the possibility that we don't have to say anyone who rides a dragon is a Targaryen. So if Bran, I know one of the other theories that's out there is that Bran might warg a dragon, and that in some way that would mean maybe Bran is riding a dragon, just metaphorically instead of literally. But would that mean that Bran has to be a Targaryen? No. I don't know. I don't even know how Bran would be a secret Targaryen. But I think that leads, and Martin loves his ambiguity. So I could very much see him giving us these people who are heads of the dragon riders in some sense, and then never telling us how it was possible that they did. And then we have to ask the questions ourselves. He may resolve it. I feel like he could not resolve it. And saying a dragon rider doesn't have to be a Targaryen, I think leaves us that ambiguity. So even if Aegon does end up with a dragon, that doesn't mean he's actually a Targaryen.
Yeah, and I think, just to add to the layers of ambiguity here, I don't think that we necessarily have to conflate the idea of the three heads of the dragon with three dragon riders. So we can easily have this concept of the three heads of the dragon, which is, let's face it, quite a new, in Song of Ice and Fire terms, a newish idea, which comes from the banner, the sigil of the Targaryens, that was invented only when the Targaryens invaded, and Aegon and his sisters, Aegon, Visenya, Rhaenys. That is where that comes from, and this idea of there being three heads of the dragon, I do wonder whether it could work on a number of levels. There will, I'm pretty sure, be three dragon riders. I personally love how the show seems to have been doing this, when we've got Dany being fire as a dragon rider, the Night King being ice as a dragon rider, and Jon being ice and fire being a dragon rider. That, for me, is a beautiful balance in terms of who's riding these dragons. And I do wonder whether that might map across in some way to the books. So then, in terms of the three heads of the dragon, we will, in the books, almost certainly have this old-fashioned Targaryen succession crisis, when we have Dany, who's there, who nobody really doubts that she is who she claims to be. But then we get Aegon, who people do doubt who he is. But if he is who he says he is, then he's actually probably slightly higher up the line of succession. And then you get Jon added into all of this, and where does he fit into that? So we have this whole idea of 3 potential Targaryens, 3 heads of the dragon. It may not be them fighting each other, but there will be 3 rival claims. And so I think that we've got different layers of what 3 heads of the dragon might actually mean.
I really like that idea of like the 3 heads could not necessarily, doesn't have to mean 3 warriors fighting the others on dragons, but it could be that like you have these 3 potential claimants to the dragon lineage. I love that. That's really interesting. Or both. I mean, it could mean multiple things because again, Martin really likes to do that, those layers of meaning rather than just one specific kind. It can be multiple things at once.
Yes, exactly. And I think that I'm going to round up 2 questions from Morally in one here, asking about in the books and the show. The question we cover a few different times, but I think that it's quite pivotal here when we're talking about this idea of the heads of the dragon. Are there any other potential Targaryen or Blackfyre heirs out there in the books or the show, that other than the 3 that we're sort of bandying around at the moment, the Daenerys and Jon and Aegon? Do you think that there are other potential claimants, potential heirs out there?
I am not a big Tyrion Targaryen fan, but I think that if Martin goes that direction, then that could potentially be muddy the waters a little bit, because if Tyrion was a child of Aerys and Joanna, I mean, he would be a bastard, but he would also be potentially could muddy the waters a little bit if he were to know that about himself. If that were to be revealed, that could muddy the waters. I don't really know that there's enough evidence for any other secret Targaryens. I mean, there probably are like dragon seeds out there, because to put it that way, as they called them in the dance, I'm sure there are Targaryen bastards or family lineages that have Targaryen in them. Someone pointed out in the chat, Gendry would have a little bit of Targaryen in him because he's he's Robert's bastard. I think that is getting further afield, because not only is he the bastard child of Robert, the Baratheons have less direct, they are a bastard lineage themselves. So he was a bastard of a Targaryen of like ultimately a Targaryen bastard. And I feel like that would be kind of a last resort and would probably end up with a similar situation as Robert, where it was, we want Robert on the throne and we'll find a way to justify it by saying, oh, well, you know, they're Targaryens, so it's fine. We'll say Robert is, you know, can be king because he was, you know, the Baratheons are bastards. I don't think there's enough textual support for any other claimants that I think could be a real threat. I feel like anything like that would come way far out of left field. And Martin doesn't strike me as the kind of writer who would kind of pull in a last second, like, oops, you know, Arianne Martell is the secret Targaryen and she's going to sit the Iron Throne because she's, you know, Martin doesn't strike me as that kind of a writer. So I would say in the books, there are a couple that could muddy the waters, but I don't even know if they would be. I really do think that the big issue is going to be between Jon and Dany and Aegon, whether he's fake or not, that those are going to be the big ones that people would circle around. And anything further afield, I'm not sure would, at least I would not find that satisfying in terms of the storytelling, to just be like, oh, here's some random person who's a secret Targaryen and they're going to sit the Iron Throne. Maybe other people would, but I personally wouldn't find that satisfying.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, just to pick up on a couple of those points, the dragon seeds issue and the how much of a Targaryen Gendry might be issue, this is something that we have to be very careful about, I think, because if you look at even someone like Dany, we think of her as pure Targaryen or pure fire. If you actually look at the genetics that's coming down to her, she's like most an eighth Valyrian, at most an eighth pure blood, so to speak. It's the amount of intermarriage that's actually been going on is really quite huge. So there are probably thousands of people out there with some kind of Valyrian or Targaryen heritage somewhere back several generations. But this is a magical world, and therefore, because she has got this sort of this inheritance in some way, that is what makes her Targaryen and special, so to speak. Just on Tyrion, I don't want to open up too much about Tyrion Targaryen. I both love and hate the idea of Tyrion Targaryen. I have to say that it's the only theory that every single time I actually look at it, I change my mind again. I never think 100% one way or 100% the other way. But then it depends on what I'm reading. And then when I go in there and I see, Tyrion's been having some dragon dreams. That's a bit weird. Why has he been having some dragon? And that might sort of drag me one way. Then I go back and look, and actually, I think the sort of the poetic element of him actually being his father's son and yet being rejected for it, that would be taken away if he actually wasn't. So I think, no, actually he probably is. And then I go back and go, oh yeah, but then there's that symmetry with Jon and Dany, with the mother dying in childbirth and all that. And I keep on swinging to and fro. So out of all of the kind of the tinfoily secret Targaryen ones, that's the one that I'm most ambivalent about. But the rest, I would agree. I don't think that they're going to have any. Even if they're true, like someone like Varys, I could personally believe that he might have some kind of Valyrian blood in him. But even if it's true, I don't think it's going to have an impact on the story. But hey, we'll see. I guess I don't think it's a biggie. I think that the biggie are the three that we know about, certainly in the books, and on the show, it's just going to be the two. We're not going to suddenly find another Targaryen appearing in the last season, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. I have gone back and forth about Tyrion Targaryen. I am currently in I don't know how I feel about it. But yeah, definitely, like there are definitely times when I listen to people talk about in favor of Tyrion Targaryen that I'm like, all right, yeah, that's a really good point. So I feel like that's one of those threads that Martin has left open, and it may be that Martin himself hasn't fully decided which side, but it is one of those theories that I could see either one working. And I think there is a reasonable explanation on both sides for one being right or not. But and then someone pointed out that people have argued that Cersei and Jaime could be Aerys's children. I can see why that would be compelling. But again, even if they are, I don't think they're going to be a major claimant to the throne. It could explain some things about their behavior or their interactions, but I don't think that it would really mess with the succession in any in-depth way.
I agree. I think that we shouldn't necessarily expect all of these things to be tied up, even in the books.
Right.
I think that if you think of the great novels of history, then there are still people who can debate stuff about what somebody's motivations were, all the rest of it. And I think this is going to be like that. I think there will be mysteries like who Tyrion's real father was that will probably carry on beyond the books.
Yep.
Mazamonti, thank you so much for the super chat. Bran has some blood raven in him, so a connection to the Targs. Now, this is interesting. So I think this gets down to the nature of what it means being part of the Weirwood network, because obviously we're not quite there yet in the books, but on the show, Bloodraven has died and been sort of sucked up, whatever is left of him, sucked up within the Weirwood network, and that becomes part of Bran. Do you think that might in some way make him part Targaryen? Is probably the wrong way of saying it, but have some kind of magical connection to the Targaryens?
Would cannibalism accomplish the same thing? Because I mean, it's the same form of it feels like the same idea that like consuming someone's essence gives you their power, which maybe I feel like Bran has his own power apart from the Targaryen blood of the dragon, if you want to call it whatever the blood of the dragon means, whatever the, you know, if there is some kind of genetic or mystical power in being Targaryen, having Targaryen lineage, I think that Bran already, I mean, he already clearly has power, has his own magical lineage of some kind. All of the Stark children do have their own, they're all wargs. And I'm not, that I hadn't thought about that before, about whether that would have given him some kind of mystical connection to the Targaryens. I'm not sure that it's necessary for Bran to have that special connection with the Targaryens to accomplish whatever his destiny is. So while it's possible, I don't know how much it adds. It's one of those like really interesting idea, but I don't know how much it kind of adds to Bran's story if he has this connection to the Targaryens based on kind of consuming Bloodraven's essence in the same way he does Jojen. I mean, maybe it could enhance his power in the same way that, like, if Jojen paste is real, which I am very much I hate to say in favor because it sounds creepy and weird.
We're all in favor of Jojen.
Jojen paste, like Jojen paste is real, guys. I can't think any other way. So it could potentially kind of enhance his magical ability if he's consuming the essence of another magic wielder. Whether that gives him a special connections to dragons, maybe. I mean, could be if there's something magical about the Targs having their connection to dragons, then maybe. So yeah, I'll say maybe on that. What about you?
I will say probably not. I think this gives him a connection to Bloodraven because Bloodraven is sucked up into the hive mind that Bran is sucked up into, and so I think this means that he's got access to what Bloodraven's experienced and seen and all the rest of it. I don't think that means that he therefore has access to Bloodraven's particular powers when he was a human. I don't think that that's the way it works. I don't think that each new person who's the one in the Avengers? Is it Wasp who can take on, not Wasp, one of them can take on lots of powers, suck powers from other people.
Oh, Rogue. Rogue,
that's it.
Rogue and yeah. X-Men. Yep.
Exactly. So, and I don't think it works like that you could just suck in powers from other people. That's not the way this seems to work. It seems to be more of an experiential thing. You become part of the experience, the collective experience. So I think for me, that's how that one works. We have one more question about succession. Kaylee Brown, a new patron. Hi, Kaylee, good to see you. Saying, if Dany does win the Iron Throne, but doesn't have any children other than her dragons, who from the books or the show do you think she would choose as her successor? On the show, I know Jon seems like a good option. What do you think? This was something which was kind of teed up, actually, last season when Tyrion is kind of pushing her on the subject and saying, you have to have some idea about who your successor is going to be. And she just doesn't want to engage with the subject at all. And so he even starts suggesting, why don't we move to a democracy or something like that as an option of a way forward. But who do you think that Dany might choose as a sort of a successor if she did inherit?
I could see her wanting to move away from, especially in the books. So I'll focus on the books first. I could definitely see her wanting to move away from a monarchy. In the books, she has such a strong, ending slavery, doing things like that I feel like she could end up maybe not in a democracy in our modern traditional sense, but perhaps something more like an oligarchy, having a ruling council of people in charge rather than a particular person I don't know how her relationship with Jon is going to play out in the books, and it also depends on whether or not Jon survives the story and what his life is like. I could see Dany. Think in the books, if Dany were to become heir to the throne and survive the story, I could see her naming some kind of council to rule after her in some way. On the show, I'm not sure on the show. It like with Jon being so close in age, the only problem that would pose would be if he dies first. She could still name him her heir. They may be close in age, but she could definitely still name him her heir. Rob named Jon his heir in his will. So I don't think that close in age range is necessarily a hindrance to naming someone as your heir. You can definitely name someone as your heir who's roughly the same age as you are. So on the show, if she were to name him her heir, it wouldn't surprise me. I don't think that his age would get in the way of that at all.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think Dany will sit on the Iron Throne and decide who takes over after her. But as a sort of a concept, then yes, I think that she would first of all try and keep it in the Targaryen family, and then after that try and work out some kind of, I like this idea of a sort of a council. I think that this is the way forward. Full democracy is clearly impractical for Westeros, but some sort of a council of nominated elders from each region would work for me, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a couple of questions which happily have come up at the same time, very similar. Donald Peoples, thank you so much for the super chat at $10, asking a very similar question to over on Patreon, John Delvonto, who are both asking if we have seen the Disputed Lands video on possible Valyrian origins of dragons. I'd see this is Amanda Crowfoot's daughter, been on here a couple of times, and whether we have any thoughts on them being the literal blood of the dragon, with there being human animal experiments to create the bond. Now, I haven't. I don't know. Maybe you have, Gretchen. I don't think I've actually seen that specific video, but I'm sure it'll be excellent because everything Amanda does is excellent. Yep. Amanda, Joe Magician, and I were over on Between Two Weirwoods with LML a couple of months or so ago when we were actually talking through. It was the mechanics of magic, but we did cover this subject as well, about this idea about whether or not the Targaryens could have been doing some sort of gene splicing, we might call it now, with dragons, and to try and improve their own sort of genetic seed in some way. And I think we all came to the conclusion that it was quite likely that that's the case, partly because of the evidence that we have of Targaryen babies often being sort of malformed and appearing quite dragonish, and them having, being slightly heat resistant and things like that, and partly because the Valyrians did have this apparent fascination with fusing different types of animals together. But have you seen the video to start with, and do you have any sort of thoughts on that as a concept?
I have not had a chance to watch that specific video. I agree with you. I am sure it's excellent. Amanda does amazing work. I love all of her videos. I believe, though, I have had conversations with her where we kind of talked about the details that she eventually kind of put into this particular video. And I definitely think that there is some kind of genetic experimentation that went on. Everything that you just mentioned about the malformed stillborn babies that look like they have dragon, there's the heat resistance, there's definitely the kind of disease resistance that a lot of Targaryens have. They don't seem to be immune to magical diseases like the shivers or grayscale. Potentially, I don't think we know enough about grayscale, but we do know that they seem to be resistant to kind of average human diseases in some sense, but not to magical diseases, or diseases that have more of a potentially magical origin. And that, to me, there's something hinky going on with their genetics in order for that to happen. I mean, that doesn't just happen naturally. Something had to have been played with. And we also know, we don't really know that dragons don't seem to get sick. So if there was some kind of human dragon hybrid at some point that went on, dragons being seemingly immune to sickness might have transferred to the Targaryens. I think that there is evidence that the Targaryens are more likely to be able to bond with a dragon. I won't say that only Targaryens can bond with a dragon, but they seem to have a special ability to bond with a dragon in ways that don't require animal husbandry or bribing. And like Nettles, compare Nettles. Like Nettles kind of wins over Sheep Stealer because she leaves out food. And that is how normal, non-magical human beings tame wild animals. That's a very normal human thing that we've seen throughout history is, feed them enough and they will come to rely on you for their food. And that's how you begin to form a bond with a feral animal. But so far as we know, I mean, the Targaryens don't need to do that. So there's something that bonds them to the dragons. And there is some evidence that the dragons can almost sense when their riders are in distress. We know that with, I believe, Jaehaerys and Alysanne, that there were stories of that. There were a couple in Fire and Blood that stood out to me where it almost seems like there was some kind of bond where the dragons could almost sense what was going on with their riders at some level. And that, to me, implies pretty heavily that there's something special. They have some kind of special connection, and a genetic connection would make sense, especially because we know the Valyrians were doing it. It's one of those where it looks like that's what's going on, and we know that the Valyrians were experimenting with, mixing up animals and potentially even humans and animals. So yeah, I would definitely think there's something about them being literal, in some sense, literal dragon people. They've got some dragon blood, dragon DNA in them somehow.
Yeah, I think we're in full agreement on this one. Just spotted in the chat, at Tim was asking about why I might be still sure that Dany isn't going to be sitting on the Iron Throne at the end of it all, when that having a woman emerging on top is perhaps the ultimate subversion of tropes. I think that there's more than one woman who might end up sitting on the Iron Throne. I think Sansa's also got a shout, but I think that the fundamental point, I don't want to labour this one too much because we're not talking about this, we're trying to focus on the Targaryens. The fundamental point is that the Game of Thrones, the power struggle for the Iron Throne, has been the cause of so much pain and problems within Westeros that actually just putting another person on the Iron Throne and saying, right, now you're the ruler, the divine ruler who can do whatever they want and everyone else has to do exactly what you say, that is not going to be, I think, the way that this is going to work going forward. So it's not so much that I don't think that she would be, that having a woman in charge is not how this is going to end. It's more the fact that I do not think having a single ruler is how this is going to end, if that makes sense. Another question from my patrons, Dracaris Noir says, Jaehaerys II was convinced by the Woods Witch to force his kids, Aerys and Rhaella, to marry. This is in connection with the Prince that was promised prophecy. What other examples or connections between Targaryens and the Prince that was promised prophecy have been given outside of this example, if any? So other than the Woods Witch turning up and saying, hey, the Prince that was promised is going to come from your line, you two really should marry. Is there any other evidence out there, Gretchen, connecting the Targaryens with the Prince that was promised?
I don't think we had that. So far as I recall, so if you in the chat know better, definitely correct me on this. So far as I recall, we don't have any other clear evidence that this is what went on, that the Targaryens kind of had this prophecy for a long time. I'm not sure it's mentioned anywhere else that the prince was prophet. I'm not sure it gets specifically mentioned. I do think we have some fairly strong evidence that there is a history of being interested in prophecy in the Targaryens, but we don't always know what the content of that prophecy was. But we know that Daenys the Dreamer has a connection with prophecy. We know that other Amanda has talked about this extensively, especially on her Baelor the Blessed video, which is one that I really, really like, about how kind of the bookish Targaryen characters, if a Targaryen character is described as bookish, that probably means that they were interested in prophecy based on their behavior, and especially based on comparisons with Rhaegar, that we know Rhaegar was really interested in prophecy, and when he was very young, he was very bookish. And he didn't even become marshal until he read in a book that he had to be a warrior. So he made that decision, but he made that decision based on his interest in prophecy. And so one could build a reasonable case that if you have a Targaryen who is described of as bookish or scholarly, that chances are likely they may have been interested in prophecy. It could very well be that the prince that was promised prophecy was a part of that interest in prophecy, but I don't think that we know specifically that it was. I think you could make a reasonable case for it, but I'm not sure you can prove that this was a prophecy that they were interested in for, hundreds of years or anything like that. But again, I may be wrong. I just can't remember any other specific examples of that being mentioned other than Jaehaerys II and then Rhaegar being interested in the prince that was promised prophecy. Do you know of any others?
Well, coming at it from a slightly different angle in terms of the potential for the prince that was promised prophecy to be being fulfilled by the Targaryens. The first thing was that we should say is that we don't have it written down, so we don't know the exact prophecy that we're talking about. There are various hints about things like the smoke and salt and the red comet and things like that. Now, the reason why Rhaegar got obsessed with this and Maester Aemon also was focusing in on this was because they thought that he met the criteria to be the prince that was promised. So what we seem to have is this ancient prophecy that may or may not be connected with Azor Ahai. Melisandre certainly seems to use them interchangeably. Maester Aemon less so, but it seems to be an old prophecy that then seems to have been brought. The Woods Witch seems to have come down. Heavy hints there's a connection across to Bloodraven here at this point, but that's a huge digression. And said, actually, you know what, this is going to be fulfilled in this line of people here. And that's the point at which the Targaryens seem to start looking for the hints that maybe this person or that person might be the person who is fulfilling the prophecy. So that seems to me how this fits in, rather than, I agree, there's no clear prophecy that we've got earlier on that this is the prince that was promised prophecy. This is it. These are the Targaryens who got interested in it. So that seems to be where it is. An ancient prophecy, then it got narrowed down, and from that moment on, the Targaryens started trying to figure out who it was actually talking about.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and Melisandre knew about the prince that was promised, but Melisandre's from Essos, and it seems like it's much more common in Essos than it was in Westeros, as you pointed out. That at some point it might have been really prevalent in Essos, but doesn't seem to have been really a thing in Westeros until Jaehaerys II and the Woods Witch talking to him.
Yes, and we shouldn't forget that the Targaryens came from Essos, so that it makes sense that those kind of prophecies did come across with them. Sanrixian is in the chat. Thank you so much, $10. That's very kind, saying, for both of y'all's brilliant insights. I can never say y'all properly. I'll turn it. I'll turn it into my proper British English for both of your brilliant insights and Targ ladies. Sanrixian, for those who do not know, is one of the many very talented artists we have here in this community. I'm sure somebody will be able to put a link across to her work. She does fantastic stuff. I was watching. Think it was, you may well have been on there yourself, actually. Gretchen went over on LML's other channel, Between Two Weirwoods, and Sanrixian was doing a fantastic piece of artwork while everybody was talking. You could watch her doing it live. It was fantastic. So thank you, Sanrixian. That's very kind. You did mention just in passing about Baelor the Blessed. This is a happy coincidence because Lady Elaine Fairchild, one of my patrons, actually said, Gretchen has talked about this before, but I thought some of your viewers might like to hear her thoughts. If you'd like to hear about it, ask her about the archetypes of Baelor the Blessed and of his sisters in the Maiden Vault. It's really interesting. So I'm very happy to bite. I'm going to sit back. I've got a glass of wine I normally save for the end that I'm going to. So would you please tell us about the archetypes of Baelor the Blessed and of his sisters in the Maiden Vault?
Okay, so this came from watching Amanda's video on Baelor the Blessed, and as soon as it's an amazing video. Highly recommend it. It really does have a lot to do with prophecy and kind of, what Baelor might have been trying to prevent prophecy from occurring, and that's why he locked up his sisters. For those of you in the chat, if you're familiar with Lucifer Means Lightbringer's kind of idea about Nissa being a character who maybe was sent into the Weirwoods and, kind of merged with the Weirwoods and is maybe potentially still present in the Weirwoods. So there's this idea of what he calls the Weirwood goddess, who is kind of the spirit of Nissa that's living in the Weirwoods, and she's trying to break free. She's trying to get out because she's, maybe she initially fled to the tree, was sacrificed to the tree, but she's stuck there somehow and wants to break out. And alongside that, we have the figure of Night's Queen, who we don't really know a whole lot about. That's something that David and a bunch of us in the Mythhead community are trying to work out the connection between those two characters. And then we also seem to have this kind of archetypal character who seems to be a servant of the Weirwoods, kind of the Weirwood assassin is what David calls it. And that would be the equivalent of, Melisandre's shadow babies. She has these babies that she gives birth to that kind of kill the enemies of, the king or whoever. Arya seems to play this role. Arya is very strongly tied to the Weirwoods in her stories. In her chapters, we see a very strong connection between Arya and the Weirwoods. She's also this kind of Deathbringer character who seems to be performing almost ritual assassinations for, justice, whether it's justice or revenge. But she seems to almost be serving the Weirwoods. She may not think of herself that way, but is strongly tied to them. So those are these three archetypes. And I started looking at Baelor and his sisters and realizing each of his sisters kind of lines up with one of those archetypes. Dana, the Defiant, what we know, she's the oldest sister who was locked up in the Maiden Vault. And what we know about her is that she was the Defiant one. She was the one who kept trying to break out of the tower. And one of the things to think about is that towers can represent trees. So a maiden in a tower could represent a maiden trapped in a tree. And we have lots of maidens in towers throughout the story. We even have a chapter called The Princess in the Tower. So Martin is definitely playing with the idea of a princess locked in a tower. Sansa, we have Ashara Dane. We have the High Tower daughter is locked in the tower with her father looking at magic spells. We have all sorts of maidens in towers. They're everywhere. And we have these three sisters who are locked in the tower, which could potentially represent a woman who was trapped in the Weirwoods. And Dana is the one who keeps trying to break out. She's the Defiant one. She keeps trying to find a way to get out of the tower. That's eventually how she gets pregnant with who becomes Daemon Blackfyre. And so she seems to kind of be like the Weirwood goddess figure. She's the spirit who's trying to break out, to break free, to escape. We have the middle sister who is Rhaena, and she's got a lot of icy symbolism involved. She seems to be the Night's Queen character. She's fairly I tend to think of the Night's Queen as potentially being someone who's passive, maybe not as in control as maybe we've been led to believe. The story that old Nan tells, Night's Queen has literally zero agency in that story. She's never the subject of any verbs. We literally know that Night's King pursues her, catches her, brings her back, declares her as queen, and then he's the one talked about as sacrificing to the others. So it doesn't seem like Night's Queen, maybe she had more power than that story implies, but to my mind, I think there's a strong possibility that Night's Queen was perhaps being manipulated or controlled into helping to create the others or sacrifice to the others in some way. And Rhaena is a very passive character. It says that she, in some sense, believed that Baelor was right to lock them up. And she eventually becomes a septa and lives a very pious life and seems to be very content in her imprisonment. And then we have Elena, who's the youngest, who is the most interesting because she seems to kind of play that almost weirwood assassin role. It says she takes after Dana, the Defiant. She wasn't quite as defiant as Dana was, but she wore black the same way that Dana used to wear black. Black is very strongly associated with kind of these shadowy assassin figures. And Elena is the one that we know of who has a very long life after the tower. Rhaena, all we know about Rhaena is she joins the Septa, and we don't know how long she lives. Dana, we don't know anything about Dana after Baelor dies. Like, Dana has Daemon Blackfyre, and Baelor dies at the altar to the mother, and we hear literally nothing about Dana after that. We don't know if when she died, we don't know if she got remarried and had other children. We know nothing about her. But we know a lot about Elena, and Elena is the one that kind of seems to carry on the torch of Dana. So one could even think of her as like Dana's successor, the one who kind of carries on Dana's legacy of breaking. She breaks out of the tower and is able to live a full life and marries multiple times and is able to have power and authority in a way that Dana never was. Dana, we know from I believe it was in, can't remember where the source, whether it was in the So Spake Martin, Three Maidens in a Tower, or whether it was in The World of Ice and Fire, that Dana was passed over for succession. I believe that was in The World of Ice and Fire, that Dana, once Baelor died, there were people who were like, oh, well, the next oldest child is Dana, so she should clearly be the ruler. But as you know, Robert, as you and I talked about earlier, she's another one of those like passed over, Targaryen daughters who was not allowed to inherit. So she never had any kind of power or authority in Westeros. But Elena ends up, through her second husband, I believe, exerting a lot of power in Westeros. She ends up, because I believe it was her second husband, maybe it was her third, becomes Master of Coin. And he, from all accounts, does not have the mental acumen to have done that job well, but Elena definitely did. And there were documents that were signed in his name, but her handwriting. So she definitely kind of seems to become a power in Westeros and almost carried on her oldest sister's legacy, which I think in kind of the archetypes that we're dealing with in the mythical astronomy world and in the Mythhead group, that seems to be the role of, either the Weirwood assassin, whether you want to call them the Weirwood assassin, or even potentially if Nissa had a child before she was killed, it could be the role of Nissa's child to kind of avenge her death and carry on her legacy, potentially connected to the last hero mythology. I know that is what David thinks, that the last hero was the child of Azor Ahai and Nissa, who ended up kind of undoing the negative legacy of Azor Ahai and, saving the world. So that is my theory. They line up. You kind of have to know that the mythical, the archetypes we're dealing with here, but that they seem to line up very well. I find it fascinating that they're all so very different and seem to line up with these other archetypes that we get throughout the story. So that is my Baelor the Blessed and his sisters.
Wow.
Discussion.
No, that's fascinating, guys. I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. Just for those who perhaps they watch my channel and don't watch or take part in sort of LML's channel or anything. When we're talking about myth heads and the myth head community, it's a group of people who enjoy exploring the kind of the mythology and the symbolism and things like that surrounding the world of Ice and Fire. There's lots of conversations around LML's channel, also between Two Weirwoods, his second channel. In terms of just to kind of ground this for one moment, George R.R. Martin, he does this a lot, these kind of archetypes, this historical figures that we can sort of see parallels across to figures in the current story. And we often try to, or we're sort of encouraged to draw out from that some kind of hint about what that might mean for the story going forward. So if you could, in a kind of a pithy way, what do you think that might mean for, given these archetypes and the parallels you're drawing out, what might that mean for the story that we've got in A Song of Ice and Fire?
Well, the biggest connection that I would draw would be between Catelyn Stark, Catelyn, Sansa, and Arya. Because to me, they play very similar roles in the story. They seem to fulfill those archetypes where we have Catelyn Stark is, many people may not realize, Catelyn Stark was the heir to the Tully, is the heir to Riverrun. She's the oldest Tully child who survived to adulthood. So she would technically be the heir to Riverrun. But because in Westeros, they do not allow it's the oldest male child, Catelyn Stark ends up marrying Ned, and instead of, being the heir to Riverrun, she's married off, as so often happens in Westeros. So in some sense, she was disinherited by the system. So we have Catelyn Stark kind of representing that initial kind of weirwood goddess figure who Lady Stoneheart is a really good archetype for that. She's resurrected, and so her spirit kind of comes back, and she's doing these kind of vengeful things, trying to get some sense of, revenge, justice, however, it falls on that. So she kind of fills that role. And then at least I see her as kind of fulfilling the same role as Dana does. And then we have Sansa and Arya, who I think play similar roles as the other two children, though I think as the other two archetypes, Sansa's got some Knights Queen stuff going on in the Vale. Arya definitely already has that Weirwood assassin kind of carrying on the vengeful legacy of the Weirwood god, of Cat kind of trying to kill the people who harmed her family. She's got a lot of death involved, but I think Arya and Sansa together actually are what fulfill that final role of the heir, the children who kind of both avenge their parents' legacy, avenge the harm and the damage that was done to their family, which I think is what Arya represents, kind of the, avenging the wrong done to the family, and then ruling and carrying on that legacy in the same way that, Elena was able to gain power in a way that and that Dana was not. I think that is Sansa's role, that Sansa will end up gaining the power then, in a sense, was denied Catelyn. Maybe not necessarily as heir to Riverrun, though I could see that happening, but Sansa is able to gain power and presence and authority in the system in the way that her mother was never able to. So I see both Sansa and Arya, that's how I would see it, is like it is their role to, they together fulfill that kind of the child of Nissa Nissa who both avenges the wrongs and then carries on the legacy into the future, would be what Sansa and Arya do together. Which is why I think they're two, Ned says they're two halves, they need each other. And I think that Sansa and Arya's role is to work together to accomplish both of those goals. And I think that we see that maybe in Baelor Sisters, Elena fulfilled both of those roles herself, but I think with Sansa and Arya, they together will kind of fulfill that role and carry on the legacy as well as avenge the family. So that would be the implication. That's the biggest one that I see happening, the biggest correlation for the present stories. I think it tells us what Arya and Sansa's future could very possibly be.
Fantastic. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed that bit as much as I did. That was totally unplanned, other than the question from Patreon, and I really love it when I can get guests on here that I can just sort of hand over and let them just shower us with their expertise. I absolutely love it. Just what I normally do at some point, sort of partway through these live streams, is just give people a quick update on what's going on my channel and what they can expect in the next week or so. Obviously, it's the build up to season 8, so I'm focusing a lot of my attention on producing materials that lead up to that. I'm going to do at least one more of my sort of character arc videos leading up, probably looking at Daenerys in the lead up to season 8, what her character arc might tell us about where it might end for her in season 8, where the story is taking her. I released finally, after many, many months, I got to the Tower of Joy in my series, working its way through Robert's Rebellion. I did my first part of the Tower of Joy videos, which I released a few days ago. That was looking at the questions of what did Ned already know? How did he know to go to the Tower of Joy? Questions like that, the build up, how did he choose the people he took with him? The second video, which I'm working on at the moment, I'm hoping I might squeeze out before season 8, is going to be all around this question of what happened at the Tower of Joy in terms of the fight, the battle. The question which comes back, I got it at least half a dozen times in the comments on that first video, is why did they fight? What was in it? What was the point of Arthur Dayne and the other Kingsguard fighting Ned Stark? Why did they fight? Did they fight? How much can we believe in what we see in or read about in Ned's fever dream? So I'm going to be covering all of those issues. It's taken me quite some time to sort of unpick what I think actually happened, but I'm reasonably confident I'm there now. So hopefully get that one out before season 8. Over on my second channel, The Well Told Tale, I mentioned it right at the top of this live stream. We're doing a story which I think is one of the hidden gems in science fiction, called The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster. E.M. Forster was a fantastic writer, but best known for writing things like A Passage to India, Howard's End, Room of the View, things like that got turned into Merchant Ivory films. Really good stuff, but occasionally he did other things, and he wrote a fantastic novella, science fiction novella, that is so prescient that it's really quite hard to believe it was written over 100 years ago. The way that he describes a civilization completely reliant on technology is astonishing, and the question that's buzzing at the back of it is what happens when the technology stops. So really excited about that. Did the first part of that this last Wednesday, yesterday, and I've got some more coming up, 2 more parts of that coming up in the next couple of weeks. Patrons, I say it every week, I cannot do this without you. Thank you. I really appreciate your support. That's why I prioritize my patrons' questions here on live streams and produce extra materials for them, and early access to my videos and audio over on Patreon. If you are at all interested in becoming a patron, or you just want to support the channel, please do check out the link down in the description, patreon.com/IndieGeek. But Gretchen, what have you got coming up? Is there anything you particularly want to draw people's attention to?
I've had a lot of stuff in my life going on. I have many things that I really want to work on and haven't necessarily had the space to do. I have my ongoing series about disempowered and dispossessed women that is both focused on it's both focused on the thematic importance of it, and especially focused on the next part of that series that I'm going to be working on is working through how we see that played out in the roles of all of the female point of view characters, because it is actually a part of each one of their stories. The only one that you could maybe debate about is Melisandre, and that all depends on who her parents are. But every other female point of view character has some element of dealing with the fact that they are at one point or another in their story the heir presumptive, and none of them are ever given that power thus far in the story. Cersei is where I'm going to start, because that definitely makes up a significant portion of her psychology, is her own perception of the fact that she is not a man in a society. And if she had been a man, she would have been able to do all these sorts of things. And so I'm going to be kind of working through that, what we see, and then moving into what I think Martin is doing with that, and why I think it's important that he gives it to almost, if not all, of his female point of view characters, but there really is only one male character, point of view character. So not just one male character, one male point of view character for whom that is a significant part of their backstory, and that's Sam. Sam is the only male character that we have who was the heir presumptive and was dispossessed, intentionally dispossessed by the male authority figure in their ruling part of their family. But every other, that's not really a part of any other male character story. And I find it interesting that Martin embeds that with his female characters, but not necessarily with his male point of view characters. So I'm working my way through that. I have another video that I'm going to be working on about the others. I have part 1 done about the origins of the others and what I think their original role was as protectors that may have been usurped for a different purpose, that they may not initially have been created in order to destroy, but they were created to guard and protect, and then someone stepped in and took them over. So I have part 2 of that coming up. I have I can't drop a lot of details, but my friend in the my friend in the chat, Questing Beast, aka Anissa, appropriately enough, her name is Anissa. She and I have been began a conversation and have been collaborating on something, and we've drawn in several of the other lady myth heads. Have been talking about that. All I will say is it has to do with Night's Queen. So we've been kind of working on kind of figuring out what's going on there. It's very exciting. We've had a lot of fun doing it. So that's going to hopefully be coming up soon. And David is asking in the chat, am I covering the show this year? Probably not. I might make a few guest appearances on what LML is doing. I am not a current show watcher. I keep up with what's going on in the show, but I don't actively watch it. I stopped after season 4, but I mean, I always know what's happening because it is something that we cover for my website. So I always know the plot. I just don't actually watch it, and I don't care about spoilers. So I probably won't. I will maybe make an appearance to talk about that, but I don't actively watch the show. Though I am interested to see how it all gets wrapped up. And as of right now, that's what I got going on. I got those 3 things happening over on my channel.
Excellent. Well, do please look out for those guys. And I think we can forgive you for not being whatever you call yourself, an up-to-date show viewer. The first 4 series are the best 4, in my humble view. So I think if you're just sticking to them, those are the best ones to stick to.
I don't know whether anyone would disagree with you, in my opinion. Like, I don't know anyone who would say that there are seasons after season 4 that are better than anything that we get in the first 4 seasons. So
I think outside of this community, there are people who do think that. I think inside this community, where we're all book nerds and slightly harsh on sometimes on the showrunners, then I think that that it's heresy to suggest that the last series was any good at all. I'm not getting into that again, guys. I've talked about that too many times already. I'm a big fan of the show, and I will definitely be covering it on this channel. Time for a kiss. Thank you so much for the super chat. How much time do you spend researching for your videos? This varies wildly, it has to be said. So on my Traveler's Guide, then I do them within the week, so it'll take me a few hours. They're quite short videos, and so it's just learning about a place and the history, and more it's about the feel of a place. And so that's more about the crafting something to try and get across the feel of a place, what somewhere smells like and what it looks like, things like that. So that can be done within a week. Some of my other videos, like the ones I've been doing on the Tower of Joy, those have, I've been working on them on and off for months, to be honest. So some of these can take on a very long time, and some of them it's normally it takes a long time when there's a question that then begets other questions that then begets other questions, and it sort of leads me off in a very long loop. So what happened at the Tower of Joy is just the introductory question. Then you get into a whole series of questions about how much can we trust fever dreams within George R.R. Martin's writing? Why on earth did, and I've mentioned this a few times on this because it's a question I keep on coming back to, why on earth didn't Ned return those bodies to the north? Things like that, then they beget other questions. So those are the ones that take me the longest because I have to follow. It's just the way my brain works. I have to follow every single rabbit down into its hole and see where it goes. So yeah, it varies quite a lot. Morally, thank you so much. $25. That's very generous. For Gretchen, thank you for sharing all this great information. Yes, thank you, Gretchen. You're getting a lot of love in the chat, it has to be said. It's well deserved. And I told you guys that you were in for a treat with Gretchen on here. Let's go back to a couple of questions from my patrons. Now, Florian is saying, I was wondering if in the books, Dany has to go beyond the wall, like in the show. Do you think that she'll be able to get her dragons to cross over the wall, or will they refuse to go just like Silverwing refused to go when Alysanne tried? And do you have a theory about why Silverwing would not cross? So this, for those who haven't read Fire and Blood, this was an episode in a section in Fire and Blood where Queen Alysanne goes up to the wall with her dragon and Silverwing, and she tries on, I think, 3 or 4 different occasions to get Silverwing to fly over north of the wall to see what was there, and each time it doesn't. It just banks around and turns and goes back. And this is surprising to her because normally Silverwing does what she wants, but also obviously what's going on there. So let's start with a basic bit there. Gretchen, I say basic, it might be a more complicated answer. Why do you think Silverwing didn't cross over? Was it a simple refusal to? Was it a magical barrier? What was going on there? And what, therefore, will be the implications for when Dany, in the books, has to, presumably, if it sort of follows the same kind of narrative path, may want to take a dragon north? Do you think it's possible?
I think that it is 100% clear that there is a magical barrier of some kind. We know that the others can't go past the wall. We know that cold hands can't go past the wall. So there, to my mind, there is definitely some kind of magical barrier. And I think there are multiple options for why Silverwing may not have wanted to cross. So one option is that the barrier is only against, for example, the others or the whites or, you know, anyone who's kind of undead, or whether or not you think the others are undead. So there could be a barrier that specifically affects the others and whites of some kind, or at least active whites, because we know they're able to carry the body of the whites through the wall. But Cold Hands, who is whatever Cold Hands is, can't pass the wall, conscious, whether or not you think it's conscious. So there's some kind of barrier involved. So it could be that the barrier is only for specific entities and the dragons just don't like it. That the dragons are part magical in some sense. So it could just be it may not specifically be warded against the dragons passing it, but the dragons just may not like it. They may not like whatever the energy is around it and just don't want to be around it. And it may be so strong, their dislike may be so strong that they're just going to avoid it. Or it could be that the dragons are also specifically included in this kind of warding, though I don't know why. I can't think of a reason why someone would ward against both others and dragons specifically. The other option is that it's a more of a general warding of magical creatures of just can't pass. Magical entities that have some kind of magic, or, you know, it could, I wouldn't really know how to define it, but it could be a general warding that includes others and, you know, conscious whites like Cold Hands and dragons and maybe even other creatures. Those are just the ones that we know of. that can't seem to be able to pass. So I could see either one working. I feel like at this point, I would probably say it might be more likely that Silverwing had a very strong aversion to whatever is going on at the wall. Not though, I mean, it won't fall down definitively. That just, I feel like if it were he can't go past, I know maybe it means that they get diverted somehow, but it definitely, Silverwing has a very strong aversion to the wall, and whether that aversion is in the ward itself or not, I think there is a strong case to be made that Silverwing didn't just not want to go for random reasons, that there's a very specific reason why Silverwing didn't want to go past the wall, whether Silverwing was prevented from it or it was just did not like the energy so much that it was just like, nope, I don't want to be here. I'm gonna go that way. I'm gonna turn around and go, kind of like magnets. It could just be kind of one of those magnetic things that you can push these two magical things together, but eventually they're gonna want to spring apart just because they have an aversion to each other. So that would be what I would say, is that I think there is a strong case to be made. We know there is a magical ward of some kind, but we don't necessarily know what is included in it or not. It could be that dragons can't go past the wall, or it could just be that Silverwing just really didn't like whatever that magical energy was. And especially if that warding has ice magic as its basis, and Silverwing is a dragon, and so it has, I guess you would say, fire is like associated strongly with fire. It could just be one of those natural, these elements don't naturally mix together, and so are going to want to avoid each other if they possibly can. It may be that I don't know if it's whether or not we can prove that it's impossible for Silverwing or any other dragon to pass the wall. I think that any dragon would have probably a very strong aversion to going past the wall, given how we saw Silverwing react. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think those are the two big options. I think there definitely is a magical ward that seems to cut things off in some way. Jon just loses contact with Ghost in terms of sort of his magical link with Ghost when they're on opposite sides of the wall. And Melisandre, I hesitate to sort of quote her as an authority on anything because she gets so much wrong, but she talks about it as a hinge of the world, and I think that that's quite it's telling. It's not that this is some sort of great magical thing that was always there. In my view, it's almost as if a barrier has been created, and therefore beyond that, one sort of magic can accumulate, and on the other side of it, another sort of magic can accumulate, and it's just that is where the barrier is. And so I loved that kind of imagery of the pardon me, the magnets, and sort of the sort of when you're trying to push two magnets together, it doesn't work. We know Silverwing, if I were cleverer, I'd be able to pull up the quote, but I'm not. It was kind of, there's imagery of Silverwing resting at the wall and kind of flinching away from the icy cold that was coming off of the wall, and it's not 100% clear whether that's just the cold that the dragon dislikes. We know the dragons don't like cold, or whether that was something from the wall that was like almost hurting it. So I tend to go with the idea that this is a barrier that dragons can't cross, rather than it's just a not particularly liking it. But whether that's a barrier that they physically cannot go over, or whether it's just on the other side of it is just this other sort of magic that is there, and its dragons don't work with it, therefore it doesn't want to go across. I think we're into slight semantics at that point. So I think that they do not / cannot cross over. What that means for the story going forward, well, I think that means that Dany will not be able to, in and of her own bond with Drogon, be able to make Drogon go north of the wall. However, what she might need is something that she can use to control the dragon, say like a magical dragon horn. So
Wherever would you get that idea, Robert? Way out of left field.
I don't know. So here's hoping somebody's like sailing towards her right now with one of them that she might be able to take at the same time as she's just thinking to herself in the Dothraki Sea, hey, wouldn't it be great if I had a dragon horn that could control Drogon? So yeah, that would be my speculation, is that I don't think this means that dragons cannot go north of the wall. I think that it means that they will need to be forced to go north of the wall through the use of dragon horns or something like that. Speculation, but it all seems to add up for me. Dark Mother, thank you so much, $10, that's very kind, saying, every time Gretchen displays her erudition, I get goosebumps. You go, girl, when you're not alone. Love a bit of erudition. And any other good words. Feel free, and any in the chat, throw out some good words. Love them. Let's pick up on another tangential question about Valyrian steel. This is from James Sidney, saying, it is said that Valyrian steel never loses its edge or deteriorates. This is very similar to weirwood. It never rots. And we know that weirwood houses the souls or essence of deceased children of the forest and maybe some first men. Do you think that the reason Valyrian steel has its hardy properties is because souls reside within it from the forging process? If this is true, could Tobbo Mott have been picking up some materials from Fleabottom for reforging it? Well, I'll throw. I think it's a fascinating question, really good question, James. Thank you so much. I'll just, on that last bit, I will just draw out the difference between the forging and reforging, so the knowledge of how to forge it in the first place and therefore create it has been lost as far as we know. Perhaps somebody somewhere in the Citadel has still got it, we don't know. But that seems to have been lost. But what we have is the ability to reforge it, so effectively to change its shape, not to create it in the first place. So we can't create new stuff. So in terms of whether Tobbo Mott is doing any sort of kind of nefarious picking up strays from Fleabottom and to put their souls into swords, I don't think so. I think he's simply reshaping what is already there. But there is the deeper question about what, therefore, might be the magic that goes into making the Valyrian steel in the first place. And Gretchen has got the answer for us now. Sorry, dropping you in that.
It's fine. Thankfully, I wrote some notes on this, so I'm not just, pausing while I get my brain time to think about it. I do think that one could make a very strong case for blood magic being involved in the creation of Valyrian steel. We know that in Martin's universe, magic has a cost, and the more significant or powerful the magic that you're trying to create, the higher the cost is. And Valyrian steel strikes me as the kind of thing that has a high cost, given, its durability, its lightweightness. This is not a natural processes cannot create this kind of weapon. And I think the cost for making it is probably fairly high. Maybe not necessarily as high as some other things, but I think probably pretty high. We know that blood magic seems to be the primary way that cost is determined in the use of magic. We know that Melisandre uses blood magic. We have all of these theories about people who bathe in blood or, sacrifice their unborn babies, sacrifice their children. And Martin seems to really be drawing on that idea that great power comes at great cost. And that cost is typically human life at some point is blood magic. So I could definitely see blood magic being involved in the creation of Valyrian steel of some kind. So at least that strikes me as very plausible, especially given when ice is reforged. I feel like when ice is split and Tobbo Mott is making Widow's Wail and Oathkeeper, it is interesting to me that we know that in universe, the explanation is it's House Lannister. So he wants to imbue the swords with like the vibrant red of House Lannister. But what he ends up getting is this really dark red that's almost bloody. And that feels like a literal representation of the cost of forging Valyrian steel. Because now you have this Valyrian steel sword that is black like or dark gray like Valyrian steel, but has ripples of blood in it. And that to me feels like it could be Martin's way of, tipping us off to the fact that the magic required to create Valyrian steel is the magic of blood and human sacrifice. That the spell forging of Valyrian steel requires some kind of blood magic in its
So
process.
you break apart the sword and it's kind of figuratively screaming and blood comes forth. Yeah, I like that kind of imagery.
It's very Star Wars-esque. I mean, I love Star Wars. I also love Star Trek. But in Star Wars, if people are unaware, the mythology behind the red lightsabers is that the kyber crystals that give the lightsabers their color, that in order to make a red lightsaber, they literally, the Sith imbue all of their rage and anger and grief and all of their negative feelings into the kyber crystal, and the kyber crystal in some sense breaks. And that's what turns it red, is that the kyber crystal is in some sense like breaking apart and bleeding into the lightsaber itself, and that's what turns it red. And so that seems like it could be a parallel idea there with the Valyrian steel, is that to make this requires blood, and something has to break, and that blood is required. Anyway, that was just what I thought of because I really love Star Wars.
I mean, I think
so.
I like it a lot, and I'll probably just repeat the same as you, but in slightly different language. I think for me, yes, there is a cost of any magic that is very clear, and so if you have the cost of creating a sword, where does that come from? That tied with fire and blood, those seem to be the two key constituents of Valyrian magic. So that implies that there was some kind of sacrifice that goes along with that. Whether that means that the spirit or soul literally goes into the steel, I don't know. But certainly there has to be some kind of sacrifice that goes into it. My personal guess is that the color is normally has a sort of a more rippled, dark effect to it, and I have a feeling that I can't really back up that it might well come from dragon glass in some kind of way. That might be some kind of link across there, if only because then that gives it some extra how these swords can kill the White Walkers and the others and all the rest of it. That kind of works for me. So yeah, I don't think it's the same thing as with Weird Woods, that it's there's the souls of something in there, but there certainly has been the sacrifice and the cost of creating that magical sword. And these have been around for hundreds of years. Swords in the real world do not stay perfect and clean and sharp and all the rest for all that time. There is clear magic going on in here.
Yep. What is interesting is we do have in the World of Ice and Fire mentions that back in Ironborn history, that the people who tried to invade the Iron Islands had, quote, soul drinking blades, which is an interesting,
very Elric, isn't it?
yeah. I mean, it's very much from Elric of Melniboné, but that I think creates space that one could potentially see that. I mean, a sword could maybe contain a bit of a person in it. It seems significant that they're specifically called soul drinking. Now, we don't know that those are Valyrian steel blades, but we have soul drinking blades. I know Joe Magician has talked about whisper jewels in Martin's work, and kind of the idea of like impressions of people that can kind of linger on in magical artifacts. So I'm not sure there's any way that we can know that the souls of people are in Valyrian steel, but I think Martin has created the space to follow through on that if he wanted to, and it wouldn't be out of left field, is the way I'll put it. I could see him doing that, but I'm not sure that we can prove it at this point.
Yeah, I'd agree. And although the kind of the symbolism of swords is different from sword to sword. There's no kind of hint that they've got different characters. They do just seem to be swords that do what they're supposed to do. So it's not like they're talking swords or anything like that. So yes, maybe they have got a soul, but we haven't got any evidence for it. Time for a kiss. Thank you so much for your super chat. Have you two had any freaky dreams about Game of Thrones? I have. Well, I'll let Gretchen answer for herself in a bit. The next question, myself, no, never. All my dreams are about fluffy bunny rabbits and clouds. I'm very pure. Never have any freaky dreams ever. Christy Miller, thank you so much for your super chat, saying, I've been subscribed to your channel for almost 2 years. You have, thank you. Thank you for introducing me to the book series and TV show. I love it when people give me feedback like this. What I've done has introduced them to the books or to another creator or to something like that. That makes this feel so worthwhile for me, that I am actually managing to direct people over to something else. That, I mean, I don't see me and my channel as the end. I see myself as somebody who can signpost you off to great people and great things in other places. So that makes me very happy. Thank you so much. We've got a couple more questions. Well, we've got a few. We can probably rattle through these ones. I've just noticed we've been going for 2 hours now. So let's sort of pick up the pace a little bit here. Over on Patreon, John St. Baptiste, who's got a fantastic music channel. Please do go check that out. If Daenerys and Aegon fail, will the Targaryens still be relevant? And Morally asks a similar question. If the throne melts down and the change in political system, will the House Targaryen still have a role? So if the monarchy is ended, I think my question, Gretchen, is if the monarchy is ended and there are still some Targaryens hanging around somewhere, would they fit in?
My short answer is no. I don't think they would. My long answer is I don't think that House Targaryen is going to exist at the end of the story. I think part of what I see as Endgame is that the Targaryens, that both the literal, physical dragons and the symbolic dragons represented by House Targaryen have to come to an end. I mean, on the show, it wouldn't surprise me if they gave Jon and Dany a magical baby of some kind. I wouldn't put it past D&D to do that. I think in the books, and this has a lot to do with, I mean, I've read the theory of Aegon, uniting Westeros against the others. I do not subscribe to it because I think that Martin has embedded a very strong anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist narrative, which is represented by House Targaryen, that they are primarily a force of violence and outside control, imperialist kind of control. And I think that he's critiquing that. That this is something that, in the same way that I think the monarchy has to end in Westeros, I think that fits with the themes that he's going for. I think that the Targaryens is kind of the representative of the violence of, invading another country with dragons and killing a bunch of people and then forcing them to submit to your rule. I think they have to end. Or at least I see there being a very strong case to be made that is a way that he would kind of reinforce that narrative that House Targaryen has to end, in the same way that I don't think there are going to be any living entities that are dragons at the end of the story. I think all of the Drogon and Viserion and Rhaegal are probably all going to die by the end of the story in various ways. I also think that if Jon and Dany are potentially still alive, that they will no longer be relevant to rule or authority in any meaningful way. And I don't think that there will be any Targaryen, I guess, real scions to House Targaryen, because I think that it seems to be that as long as there are Targaryens, there will be those who want to put them back in power. And I think that for Westeros to move on from, the kind of violent heritage that it's had since the Targaryens invaded, that the Targaryens kind of need to pass on and have history move on without them. So
Yeah, I agree. I think this is something I've said in different ways and a number of times. I cannot see the dragons surviving. Possibly death isn't how they're all going to end, but I can't see there being dragons round and about in Westeros at the end of all this. Similarly, the Targaryens symbolize, as you say, this kind of conquering force, a sort of entitlement. And I think I should probably clarify, because a lot of people can, or some people have kind of equated saying or pointing out this symbolism of the Targaryens as being this very entitled conquering force who all about having power, as meaning a critique on Dany as a person, as a character. Yeah. And I think that we have to draw a clear line between the two, is that just because the symbolism is clearly there for the house and that she has some elements of that within her, does not necessarily mean that we have to damn her as a character and say that those traits they sum her up, because there's a lot more to her character than that.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I find so fascinating about what Martin does with the Targaryens, is because I think he does have that they as a house represent this violent history, and yet he finds a way to get us to sympathize with individual characters within House Targaryen. I mean, most people would say Jaehaerys was a good ruler. And I love the tension there in saying, this is a character I can sympathize with. This is a character I actually really like. They still, their heritage represents something negative. And Dany, in a lot of ways, I think, is subverting a lot of those things associated with her house and her history. She wants to free the slaves. She wants to, end slavery. I think she represents, if violence can be a means of achieving positive ends, a necessary means to achieving positive ends, I could see that being associated with her. But I do think we need to distinguish between House Targaryen as a whole and kind of what I think the role that House Targaryen plays within Martin's world building, and maybe even individual characters within the house, Dany especially because so much of Dany's legacy is deciding which parts of her own heritage are ones she wants to embrace and which ones aren't. Just like Arya is trying to, figure out what's her identity. What does it mean to be a Stark? What does it mean to be a wolf? Like, a lot of characters struggle with that. I think Dany especially is trying to figure out, what does it mean for to be a Targaryen? Viserys gave her a very specific understanding of what it meant to be a Targaryen. Targaryens means ruling Westeros, being in charge, going back to Westeros, reclaiming the throne. Dany, so she has that going for her. She knows a lot about the Mad King. What does it mean to be the daughter of a man who went crazy? And that's another part of her family legacy that she kind of has to negotiate. Does that mean anything about me? Am I just the sum of the past sins of my family and my house? Or am I my own person? And how do I negotiate those things? And which are the things of a part of my family heritage that I want to claim as my own, and which are the things that I want to reject? And so it is very careful. We do have to be very careful about distinguishing between, we can critique House Targaryen as a whole and even parts of Dany's story without necessarily saying, well, because her family are a bunch of, colonialist, imperialist people who conquered Westeros violently, that means we can just condemn her wholesale. Because I think Martin resists any kind of pegging a character in any particular corner based on their family history or their house legacy. He does that all the time. Tyrion is more than just a Lannister. All of the Lannisters are more, they also are struggling with how much of my father's legacy identifies me as a person. So I don't think we can just say, well, Dany's family history is is really violent and aggressive, and so therefore we can just defame her because she's her own person. All of us, yeah. So
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with you.
I mean, and this is where the beauty of George R. R. Martin's writing comes in, because he writes a character-driven narrative that also works on a thematic level.
Yes.
So what we're doing is we're dealing with the characters, but the characters' ends also have thematic resonances. So when we're looking at what happens with Dany, we are looking at what happens to her as a character, and that has to work within her character arc and who she is and her drives and things like that. But also we are looking at symbolically what is happening with House Targaryen, because that is what she is embodying and symbolizing, and many other things, not just that. But we're having to look at these things on a number of different layers. Mod Mary 1, thank you so much for the super chat. This kind of moves us on away from just talking about the Targaryens to sort of slightly broader issues, which very happy to do, as we've got about 4 or 5 more questions for patrons. Mary asks, do you believe that all magic needs to end at the end of the story? Fire and ice magic are both evil and use blood sacrifices. Let's go. Yeah, I'll throw this one to you first, Gretchen. I have thoughts on this that I suspect people have heard before, but what are your thoughts?
It's interesting because I was having this conversation with my older brother the other day, and I don't necessarily think that the story is going for all magic needs to end in kind of the Tolkien-esque way. In Tolkien, it's very much like the age of the elves and has ended, and now it's the time of mankind, and therefore there's really not really any kind of magic to speak of. I'm not sure that that's the direction the story is going. I think there's a strong case to be made that magic is out of balance in the same way that like the weather is out, that the climate is out of balance, that magic seems to have almost has this kind of tidal ebbs and flows sense to it. And it feels very much like Martin has created a world in which magic may always be a part of it, but maybe humanity might not have access to it. That we don't know for certain whether or not blood magic is required for, say, the children of the forest to use whatever magic that they use. We don't know for sure that is a part of the way that they access magic. But it definitely seems to be a way that human beings access magic. The human beings access magic by blood sacrifice. So it could be that magic in and of itself may not end, but something needs to be done about the fact that human beings are accessing things about human access to magic. It may be that human access to magic is going to inherently require this kind of sacrifice, and so there somehow that might end, that human beings no longer have access to magic. But I'm not sure that I would. I actually can't say for certain where I think he's going with that. That's one of those questions that I haven't thought a whole lot about it, and it's never been kind of my main area of investigation in the series. So I don't have a lot of more fully formed thoughts than that is kind of my impression of where I could see him going, but I can very easily be swayed in another direction. So
yeah, well, my thoughts on this are that it's actually not so much about whether magic survives. I think that's how the Maesters would look at it, but right. I don't think it's so much about whether magic survives. One of the inspirations for this, there are many, but one of the inspirations for this, George R. R. Martin says, is Robert Frost's poem Fire and Ice, that one day I'm going to memorize. But basically it's about two opposing forces, both of which could destroy the world, and we shouldn't look on one as better or worse than the other. It's just different ways of the world being destroyed. And taking all that across, what we're looking at is a kind of a high level of how the world could be destroyed. It could be destroyed by ice, shown with the White Walkers. The others could be destroyed by fire, shown by the dragons, Valyrians, and all the rest of it. It could happen either way. What we need is not one to suddenly defeat the other. We need both a balance. So this is about balance, and it's about removing the threats. It's about sort of denuclearizing the world, as it were. So getting rid of the weapons that are there that could destroy everything. Now that probably leaves some kind, this is a magical world, so that probably leaves some kind of background magic. I could certainly see that the Weirwood network equivalent magic, warging, things like that, they seem to be very natural part of how the world just operates. So they could certainly still stay around. Magical creatures certainly still stay around. I don't think that magic per se is going to suddenly disappear, but I think that the threats have to be managed, diminished in some way, so that humanity can thrive, not just be in the middle of these two forces coming, attacking all the time.
I like that a lot. Yeah, I think that, yeah, absolutely.
Good.
Yeah, I definitely, yeah, I like that idea of needing balance. And the dragons do, you know, kind of heavily favor the fire side, and then we have the others who kind of represent the ice taking over it. So yeah, I like that
Excellent. A lot. Mithy, I just saw what you said in the chat. I can see you're getting a huge amount of love from people in the chat as well for what you just said. You have my support. I'm just so happy that I can play a small part here in helping in some way. This is an amazingly supportive community. I would highly recommend you just throw yourself as much as you can and as much as it can help into this community and try and get the support from this community. So just sending you best wishes and love your way. A couple of fun questions just to sort of be, actually, no, before we get onto that, I think it's quite a serious one, actually. Serious is probably the wrong word. Pegleg Pete says, could the timing of direwolves returning to the Starks also have an effect on the return of magic? We know that dragons do, but why not direwolves? So this is a sort of how magic works kind of question, really. When dragons came back, people could do lots more magic. Is it actually also about when direwolves come back? What do you think? Is there a link between direwolves and the state of magic in the world?
That is a really interesting question that I have not thought of. It does seem very convenient that we have this resurgence of warging, especially to have all of the Stark scions be wargs of some level, because I think that's fairly well confirmed that all of them have some level of warging ability. Some may, you know, Bran and Jon are clearly stronger than the other ones, but I think that all of them have some kind of warging ability. That does feel very convenient, and I don't think that Martin tends to deal in conveniences. I'm not sure. It could be connected. It could be one of those situations of there is a need for kind of an equal and opposite reaction in magic when you have you know, one strong magic coming up than the other. I mean, I'm going to use Star Wars again, just because it's the first thing that springs to mind, like in The Last Jedi, when Snoke says, like, darkness was growing and light rose to meet it. That idea of, like, if one side is growing stronger than maybe the other side, or multiple sides might have an equal and opposite reaction of, you know, bringing up magical ability in some way. I'm not sure that we can make the case that warging is inherently connected to magic in the same way that the dragons may be, just because I think we have a much longer lineage of warging and green seeing being present without necessarily the extremes of fire and ice being present. You know, we know that the Children of the Forest had green seeing and those and skin changing as abilities probably prior to the creation of the others. And that seems to be where that warging is very much tied to whatever the magic is that the children of the forest have, seems to be tied to that. So I think that is the kind of magic that I could see, as you said, continuing to exist after whatever balance is reached with fire and ice, because that seems to me almost to be a separate, not necessarily as strongly connected to each other as the fire and ice kind of imbalance seems to be. What do you think about that? Like I said, I'm just talking out of of wherever, because I hadn't thought about it that
Talking
way.
out of your
That's
mouth.
Interesting. Talking out of my random brain space.
I think I like the thinking. The dragons coming back, it seemed to be precipitated. I don't want to get into moon meteors simply because LML's there and it would just give him too much satisfaction to know. Give him credit for his theories. But the comet certainly seemed to be heralding a return of magic, which brought the dragons. The presence of the dragons seems to encourage magic. So there seems to be some kind of principle that big magic allows more magic to happen. Melisandre, when she's at the wall, she says that her powers are stronger there. The wall is not just a physical wall, it's a long magical barrier of some kind. So it appears that having some magic seems to make more magic happen and be able to happen. Having said that, I tend to the view that you do, that direwolves and warging seems to be a lot more kind of natural. Direwolves seem to just have been there. That's just they. It's not that they disappeared off the face of the planet. They just happened to be north of the wall rather than south of the wall, and the ability to warg appears to have been carrying on for years anyway. So I don't think that this was heralding a new power of some kind. I could certainly see that this is what happened here was in line with my principle of if in doubt, blame Bloodraven. Bloodraven sent the direwolf, the pregnant direwolf, south of the wall with those pups, knowing that and then brought them to the attention of the Starks, knowing that would help precipitate the Starks' magical powers. I think that is certainly the case, but I don't think that it brought about more magic as a general principle. Dark Mother, thank you so much for the super chat. Respect for mods making the fandom chats feel safe. Absolutely. There are some fantastic moderators, both here and in the wider fandom. I've seen Chrissy of Oldstones has been doing amazing work today. I've seen her doing lots of great stuff in the chat. And the whole point there is to allow people to know that it is a safe space to share whatever you need to do. It's because this is where we get to talk about A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, but it's a community. So moderators, thank you. This, yes, I do this, but it would be meaningless without moderators actually creating the community. So thank you. I agree with that completely. Jack Hurst asks, which houses are your top 3 favorites? So we're sort of coming towards an end. Let's do a few random questions. So Gretchen, what are your top 3 favorite houses?
I mean, it depends on what one means by favorite. I will say I am endlessly fascinated by the Targaryens for all of the things that I've said before. I think there's so much ambivalence involved with them as a house. I love what Martin is doing, what it seems like Martin is doing with his critique of, imperialism and war and violence, and yet creating characters that we can empathize with, sympathize with, and enjoy about them. I like the complexity of that. So I am fascinated with House Targaryen. So that's always going to rank top on my list, just because it's such it's so messy, and I love messy. I love the complicated family dynamics of the Martells, especially with Doran and Arianne being so very similar in personality, and that is I think they share similar flaws, and that is why their relationship ends up being the way it is. And I enjoy that a lot. I love complicated family dynamics. So I enjoy the kind of intergenerational complexity of the Martells. And so my other favorite, I guess, I really like the Stark characters that we have. Like, I like my Starklings, all of the Stark children. I'm not sure I would say they're like my favorite house. There are a lot of interesting characters in the house, in House Stark, but I tend to prefer the messier. As you can tell, I like the messier things.
Nah,
So
Nessie's good.
yeah, I also really like, again, I don't really say like, I enjoy, again, the complexity of the Lannisters. I'm not like a Lannister stan. Like, I don't think that they've, done nothing wrong. I really enjoy how complicated and
Oh,
messed
name
up
one thing the Lannisters have done wrong. Come on. They're a perfect family.
they are pure as the driven snow. They've never done a bad thing in their life. They are the pinnacle of honor, and um
I'm sure Tywin would have you believe that.
I'm sure he would love for people to believe that. But so yeah, I enjoy the very messy, complicated, but it's so weird to call them favorites, because I feel like favorites implies a certain degree of just, oh, I love them, and I'm like, I really enjoy them, and I find them fascinating, but they're also the very messy things. So
Yeah, I'll take partiality out of this. I think I love and enjoy House Martell for the same reasons you do. I think that the politicking that they've got going on, as well as all the messy relationships, really works for me. I think that's great fun. I have a soft spot for. And I'm doing a series of random videos with Gemma, Secrets of the Citadel, that we haven't yet got a good name for the title of the series, but it's something like really cool second tier houses that are very mysterious and have probably got something big important going on, but we don't know exactly what it is. And under that bracket, I would put things like House Dane, House Reed, House Hightower, that we don't know half as much about that we really should. I love that kind of just digging into those houses. That there's House Manderley. I think I'd put another one in that mix. That just there's clearly something going on that we have yet to learn the full truth of. So yeah, if I had to pick, probably Martell, Dane, and Reed, I will go with. Donna Daly, thank you so much for the super chat. Sorry, a bit off topic. What do you think Ned would have done if Jon had looked like his father? I think this is a fantastic question. So I'm going to throw it to Gretchen, who's cleverer than me, and we'll have an answer.
Someone mentioned in the chat, I'm so sorry if I can't remember who, that maybe he would have passed him off to the Danes, which I think one could make a strong case that he could have given them to the Danes, because he would have, they would have been able to explain his looks and just said, maybe Ashara had a bastard, or I could see that happening. I'm not sure that the long-term shaving of his head would have been feasible in the same way that it works for Egg or Varys, if one thinks that Varys might be a Blackfyre and that's the reason he shaves his head. I don't imagine that, given Ned's status, I feel like there would have been questions that, Egg as just like the squire of some random hedge knight, no one's going to look too deeply into why the random squire shaves his head. Varys is foreign, and he's got so many other things about him that I feel like people are just like, oh, right. Of course, no one questions Varys shaving his head either. No one thinks too deeply about why it is that he's bald. I think that if Ned were to bring a bastard home and continuously shave his head, people might get suspicious. Yeah. So I don't think that would work. I don't think dyeing his hair would work for the same reason, because I think that you really would have to maintain it. As someone who dyes my own hair,
that's not natural.
I just drink a lot of wine and it turns my hair into this color.
Dunk it in.
Yeah, I just kind of marinate my hair in it. But as someone who dyes my own hair, so much maintenance is required. And silver hair is such a unique feature within Westeros that as soon as Jon's roots would have started showing, again, there would be questions. Unlike with Sansa, I think Sansa has a hair color that is, you can kind of get away with maybe not dyeing it as regularly because having, auburn hair is not that unusual. But having silver hair is highly unusual. Only a few people have them. And as soon as Jon would have started showing silver hair and everyone knows that it's being dyed, again, I think people would have started asking questions. So I would say probably the most plausible thing that Ned probably would have done is given him to the Danes.
I think that's exactly what I was going to say, actually. It's the most sensible thing. I think if you've seen my most recent video on the Tower of Joy, I think all the evidence is that Ned had a hunch that there might be a baby there. At least he had to be preparing for the idea that there could be a baby there, because, hey, Rhaegar and Lyanna had been shacked up for a year or so, and these things are possible. Exactly. Yep. So I think he had to be prepared for the possibility. So I think he was probably thinking about what he might do. He wasn't to know that Lyanna was going to die. So I think that may well have been a surprise to him. Surprise is probably the wrong word. He probably, but I think he had to think on his feet a little bit more with that. But I think that he probably would have had some kind of half-baked idea that maybe she could go off into exile with her child, and he would try and protect her somewhere off in the Free Cities. I don't know. That sounds like the kind of thing you might do. But once he got House Dane involved and on board, then yeah, it would have made perfect sense for a child with that colouring to be based down with the Danes. So yeah, I think I would agree with that one. Captain Unephiles, I think that is, says balance equals men in Essos and White Walkers in Westeros? Question. Could, I guess, but then I think if I'm thinking of the balance here being the balance between the ice and fire forces, both of whom could destroy the whole planet, then I think perhaps just sort of saying, well, here's the line, this side can be on one side, the other people can be on the other side, that seems to be just delaying a war. I think that actually what we need is some kind of de-escalation in some way. So that's where I think the balance has to come. It's not just balance, it's about a sustainable balance. It doesn't have to be forever, but some sort of sustainable balance. We have a couple more questions from my patrons. So guys, if you've got any more questions, now is the time to drop them into the chat. Miranda Davis asks, says, this is not a specific Game of Thrones question, but do content creators benefit from subscribers not skipping ads? I heard this somewhere recently and now I need to know. The short answer is yes, that it does help. So as far as sort of income for content creators who've got adverts in front of their videos, that does generate an income. Each individual advert probably on its own isn't huge amounts of money. It's the sort of the aggregation of thousands of these things that actually adds up to some sort of income. But the answer is yes. Whenever an advert plays in front of a video, then a goodly chunk of that goes over to YouTube and they keep that, and the rest goes to the content creator. So yes, it does help is the short answer. And thank you very much for asking that. So that's very kind. It's the kind of thing that people do ask from time to time. If you want to support not just this channel, but any channel out there, and you can't afford to be a patron or anything like that, there are a few things that you can do to support that channel. Probably the best thing is to share. But comment, get involved, liking stuff also works. But watching the adverts, watching things all the way through from beginning to end, these are things that YouTube likes. So if you do all of the things that YouTube will like, then that will be helping that creator a lot. So thank you for asking. That's really, really kind. Kathy Stark says, not a Targaryen question. I was listening to your and Gemma's House Dane chat. This was in that series with the implausibly long title. And suddenly thought, if Mira's parents are Howland Reed and Ashara Dane, are they both Jojen's parents? Also, you may have said, I don't remember. Yes, I think so. I think that the way I see it happening, and we don't have any information after what happens in the Tower of Joy and down at Starfall, is that Ashara Dane and Howland Reed go up to the Neck, and there they set up home. And they've got Mira, and also Jojen comes along a little bit later. So yes, there's no indication that they've got different parents from anything they say or anything like that. Did you? This is the second time the sort of Jojen and Mira and Howland and Ashara have come up. Have you got any sort of pearls of wisdom on what might be going on there? My take is that Howland and Ashara were an item and produced Mira. And I'm not going to go into all the convoluted logic that leads me there, but have you got any kind of particular thoughts on what might be going on there and what the sort of the role of House Reed is?
I do not actually, but I'm someone had brought that up recently, or maybe I saw it on your stream that you were talking about the Reeds and Ashara Dane and Howland, and I'm fascinated by it. So I have no pearls of wisdom. I haven't thought much about the Reeds, but I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, because I find the idea of that fascinating, and I think that's really interesting. So looking forward to hearing about that.
Well, I will give you the starting point for it now, and then feel free to go and explore for yourself, because I didn't come up with this. There's other people who've done this. I'm always only ever standing on the shoulders of giants. But the starting point is that when we get to this story of what happened at the tourney at Harrenhal, and you have the story that Mira and Jojen are telling to Bran, and this is what they have been told by Howland. And it's a very stylized story, and it's a story where all of the characters seem to be given nicknames according to their sigils. So you get the young pup being Benjen, you get I think it's the Dragon Prince for Rhaegar, and so on. And the only two characters who don't have that are Ashara Dane, who is the maiden, and Howland Reed, who is the lad. And so it's shaped as if this is a story about these two characters. And then you go, well, what is it that's in this story? And you actually think, so what the story Howland Reed is telling is not about this great meeting of these powerful people. It's actually this story about these details of this woman, and her eyes were of purple, and she has this dark hair. And here's this list of all these people she was dancing with. So suddenly it becomes this quite personal in looking at Ashara Dane. And then you have to say, okay, so this is the story he told his kids, which makes it start to feel as if it's like a How I Met Your Mother story. Or you have to say, if it's not a How I Met Your Mother story, this is the story that Howland Reed told his kids so many times that they remembered it, that ends with, or starts with, so there was this really hot woman who I met just before I met your mum, Mira. She was amazing. Let me tell you about her hair. Let me tell you about her eye. It just doesn't seem to work. And so the moment you start thinking, okay, so there's at the very least, Howland Reed seems to have a bit of a crush on her. And then you can sort of follow on from that about what that might mean going forward. So there's a lot of stuff out there. None of it is actually explicit, but it's kind of hinted at. So that's my starter for you. Do please go and check out. So there's some great essays out there on it. And while I've been doing that, we've got a whole load of super chats. I was about to wind up, guys. You always do this. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Linda Prosuta, thank you. $50 is very generous. Do you think the words of Jorah Mormont talking about serving the rightful king will come up again? Danny heard him say it in the show. Is this in the books as well, Gretchen? Can you remember?
I cannot remember at all. I don't know.
No, I'm not sure.
So, my head.
So Jorah yes, he talks about serving the rightful king. The implication is that he is thinking that because he's giving his service across to Dany, that he's wishing to serve Dany. But obviously, in the show, they're trying to flick this into, and we will see. I'm sure we'll see this in episode 1. We'll see, or episode 2, or whenever they do the big reveal, that we're Jon is being presented as being the rightful king. They're not going to, I'm pretty sure they're not going to muck around with any, but actually technically, is he there? Is there any uncertainty about what might happen about baby Aegon or anything like that? It's just going to be clear cut. Jon is the rightful king. I'm pretty sure they're going to go down that route on the show. Now, I think actually, Linda, that this is going to be put in the show as a bigger issue, that it's not just about who Jorah might be thinking of the rightful king is, but who all of the people around Dany might think the rightful king ought to be. And I think that whereas she won't have too many problems with the idea that she might be sleeping with her nephew and all the rest of it, and she might think, oh, hang on, we'll just marry and rule together. I think that those around her might start thinking, hang on a moment, which of these two do I actually want to be ruling? So I think that is what they're teeing up with this kind of language. We saw it a bit with Tyrion. We saw some hints about it with Varys as well, whether or not people, given the choice, would actually rather be serving Jon than Dany. And I think that's going to be one of the big underlying themes that we're going to get going through season 8.
Painkiller Jane in the chat said that that's a line from the books, but it's Barristan's line. It was given to Jorah on the show. And that actually makes a lot of sense because because there is the Barristan Turncloak theory that like Barristan is going to potentially defect from Dany and support Aegon. So in the books, that it is a line from the books, but it's Barristan. Barristan is the one who talks about serving the rightful king. So if there is like a Turncloak idea embedded in the books, it would be Barristan doing that. I can't imagine Jorah, given Jorah's level in the books, given Jorah's level of obsession with Dany, I can't imagine him serving anyone else unless, I mean, he was flat out rejected from Dany, flat out rejected him, and yet he's still, his level of obsession with Dany, I think, would prevent him from turning cloak. But I could see Barristan in the books making that shift. And since it's his line in the books, that very well could happen. But I don't know that that has any bearing on what Jorah does in the show. Maybe he turns cloak, maybe not.
Yeah, and I think in the books, I would just add in terms of Fagon, it's not just going to be a little, here's an added extra little complication. This is going to be a full-scale additional Targaryen character that we need to deal with, who's going to have a serious invasion. He's got the Golden Company, he's got John Connington already. I could certainly see, I think I was talking to LML about this a few weeks ago, I could certainly see Darkstar, who's a book-only character, but he's from sort of a cadet branch of House Dane. I could see him grabbing the sword, the sword, and then going over and forming part of the Kingsguard. And once you've suddenly got this kind of Arthur Dane symbol being there, that makes him start to look almost authoritative. They talk about whispers of friends in the Reach. If that happened to be House Hightower, that would be massive because they're hugely important and influential. And so, yes, you're starting to get, and if they take Storm's End as well, that gives them this kind of Baratheon link. So it's not going to be just a little added extra. This is going to be a massive plot line in the Winds of Winter, what happens with this invasion, which has happened before Dany's invasion, we have to remember.
Yep.
Donald Peoples, thank you so much. $10 per my usual ending super chat. Always a pleasure, Robert, and thank you for the unexpected pleasure of introducing me to Baal. I'm so glad. As I said earlier, this is one of the things that gives me the greatest pleasure, is being able to signpost you to other people. So please do go and check out all of Gretchen's stuff there. There are links in the chat, and I've put a link down to her YouTube channel down in the description as well. Maura Lee, thank you so much, saying, thank you, Robert and Gretchen, for this highly enjoyable live stream. You're very welcome. $25 more, you're incredibly generous, as always. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And then Talking Joe, $10. I don't really have a question. I really appreciate the quality of your content and all the great people you bring aboard. Thank you so much. Oh, and another one I've missed. Guys, you're very generous. Thank you so much. Janet Kang, $15. I'm a new subscriber and love your channel. My Patreon subscription doesn't start until next month, but I wanted to go ahead and thank you for your fantastic content. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Janet. It's amazing to not just super chat, but being a patron. Patreon is, I think, the best way to support whichever creators you want to support. It's independent of YouTube, so it gives us sort of a second separate sort of level of income. It's also a lot more stable than what YouTube provides. So if there's some sort of content creator out there that you wish to support, then I would highly recommend seeing whether or not they do Patreon. I think I've caught up now, so let's end with a final fun question from, as Maura Lee did another super chat there. Let's end with a fun question from Maura, saying, if given the opportunity to own a dragon egg, what would you do with it?
I definitely wouldn't sell it. I think that dragons are dangerous and I wouldn't want a dragon egg to fall into the wrong hands. So I would probably keep it. I don't think I would hatch it. If there were any way to prevent the dragon from hatching, I would probably do that, other than destroy the egg. I mean, and maybe I don't know. But I wouldn't sell it because I wouldn't want it to fall in the wrong hands, and I wouldn't hatch it myself because I just think, as much as I think dragons are cool in fantasy literature and I love them and I think they're awesome, the idea of a real dragon is terrifying, and I would not want to have one, and I wouldn't want other people to have them either because I think they're just too much potential for destructiveness. So I'm going to be super boring and say I would just keep it because it's pretty. Like
so responsible. I mean, I was gonna say I was gonna sell it to the faceless men and then tell everyone I just threw it overboard. But clearly you're the person to leave in charge of the world rather than me. Okay, guys, thank you so much. The chat has been amazing today. The questions have been absolutely top drawer. Gretchen, do you want to remind everyone, if they're looking for you on the internet, where they can find you?
Yes, you can find me on my YouTube channel, Bael the Bard. You can find me on Twitter as @GNEllisWriter, or you can find me on my personal website, gnellis.com. And I do have some essays and such over on thefundamentals.com. So that's where you can find me. I am on Twitter a lot, so that is primarily where I hang out. Twitter and then YouTube. So
excellent. And thank you so much, dear. I knew you'd be great, and you have been, so thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. This has been delightful. I had a great time.
Well, good. I'll definitely have you back on again if you are up for it.
Yes, always.
Oh, good. Okay, guys. Well, thank you so much. I am now starting to move into Game of Thrones Season 8 territory, so I'm going to be upping to 2 live streams a week soon. My normal Thursday slot, this slot, is going to be staying the same, but I'm also going to do one on Sunday before the Game of Thrones episodes, 4 hours before the Game of Thrones episode, and I'll keep that to a strict 2 hours, not this kind of 2.5 hour nonsense that I seem to be getting into recently, just so we've all got time to go away and have a bite to eat before the episode. And oh dear, another super chat. Guys, thank you so much. This was Anders Arsdalen with 50, I'm going to say Norwegian kroner.
That sounds about right.
That sounds good. Thank you so much for that. That's very generous. If you are, so I will be back here next Thursday. If you're at all interested in watching more of my live streams, then somewhere up here will be appearing a little icon. Click on that one. If you are at all interested in supporting me on Patreon, somewhere up here will be a little icon that you can click to go and do that. So thank you, everyone. Take care.
Yep.
And I shall see you next time.
Bye, everyone.